The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in the world. Not the tallest, not the most dramatic, the most ancient. They've been standing in some form for close to 480 million years, which is a number so large it stops meaning anything to the human mind about 4 words into the sentence, the way very large numbers always do. The way the distance between stars sounds like something you could understand if someone just explained it more clearly, but you never quite can, because the mind has limits and time at that scale is one of them. The Appalachians predate the Atlantic Ocean. They predate most of the living things on the planet. When the first recognizable insects were still figuring out how to fly, those mountains were already old. What that means, practically, is that they don't look like mountains anymore. Time has done to them what time does to everything it's allowed to work on long enough. The edges have been worn away. The peaks are round and low and covered in forests so dense that in summer you can stand in the middle of them and see nothing in any direction except green and shadow, and the occasional gap where a deadfall has let a slice of sky through. They don't have the severity of younger mountains. They have something else instead. Something that might be called patience, if you're willing to assign a quality like patience to something that isn't alive. Though the more time you spend in those mountains, the less certain you become about what category the mountains belong in. Whether alive is quite the right word. Whether the absence of obvious biological function is the same thing as the absence of awareness. There are people in the communities that have grown up around those mountains, the small towns and the hollows, the families whose names have been on the same land for 200 years, who will tell you things about the Appalachians that the guidebooks don't include. Things about certain ridges, certain creek systems, certain sections of certain valleys that have a reputation. Not a reputation built on 1 story or 2 stories, but on the accumulation of accounts that goes back far enough that the originating stories have been lost, and what remains is just the knowledge, passed down the way useful knowledge gets passed down, that you don't linger in certain places, that you don't call out in certain hollows, that you pay attention to how the air feels when you cross from one watershed into the next. These are not people who believe in ghosts, necessarily. These are people who have lived close enough to the land long enough to have developed a specific and detailed empirical knowledge of it, the same way that coastal fishermen develop a knowledge of weather patterns that the meteorologists later find ways to explain with better instruments. The experience comes first. The explanation, when it comes at all, comes later. What you're about to hear are accounts from people who went into those mountains and came back changed. Changed in a specific way. Changed in the way that happens when the mind is the first thing to break, when the environment you're in starts to behave in ways that violate the rules your mind depends on, and your mind, rather than finding a clean explanation, begins to generate possibilities that it would never have generated in a more cooperative environment. When the strangeness of a place and the strangeness of a mind in crisis start to reinforce each other in ways that are very difficult, afterward, to separate. Each of these people came back. That's worth noting. The mountains didn't keep them, but they came back different. And the things they describe, taken together, have a coherence to them that I find difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or to the common distortions of stress perception. There is a shape to what they experienced. A family resemblance between the accounts that I think is worth paying attention to. These are their stories. I've changed names where people asked me to. I haven't changed anything else. I took the job because it was simple. Trail maintenance volunteer, a 3-week commitment, a specific section of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia running south into Virginia, and then beyond that a solo section hike. No deadline, no crew, just me and 12 days of food and the trail. I had done longer solo sections. I had done longer volunteer stints. What made this one different was why I was doing it, which was that my father had died 14 months before and I had been, in the time since, not quite managing. Not visibly. Not in the ways that people notice and respond to. I was going to work, completing my tasks, maintaining the surface of a functional life. But underneath the surface there was something that had not processed, had not moved through, had not done the thing that grief is supposed to do, which is diminish. It was sitting where it had landed, unchanged, and I had the idea, born from years of going to the trail when things were wrong, that the walking would help. That something about sustained physical effort in a place my father had loved the idea of, the kind of mountains he'd described to me when I was small, with that particular quality of reverence he reserved for things he hadn't yet been to, would metabolize what 18 months of ordinary life had failed to touch. My father was not a hiking person. I want to be clear about that because it matters to why I went. He was a mountains person, which is different. He had grown up in eastern Kentucky, in the part of the state where the hills start to suggest what they might become further east, and he had carried that landscape with him the way people carry the first landscapes they knew. He had a quality, when he talked about those places, of describing them the way you describe a person you loved before you knew what love was, from the inside out. Without the vocabulary for what you were feeling, but with a precision about the details that is its own kind of eloquence. He talked about the way the light came through the trees in the late afternoon, the way a certain kind of fog moved in a certain kind of hollow, the sound of a creek heard from a long way off, how you knew it was a creek and not wind because of something in the rhythm of it, some quality that wasn't quite pattern and wasn't quite randomness, but was somewhere between them. He died of a thing I won't name because naming it still does something to me I'm not ready for. He died in the spring. I did not go to the mountains that summer. The first October without him, I barely left my house. The second October, I packed my bag that I planned carefully. I always planned carefully because I was a careful person and because the trail doesn't forgive the kind of mistakes that careful planning prevents. I had my gear dialed to 31 pounds with water, my maps printed and annotated and backed up digitally, my food calculated to 12 days at 2,500 calories per day with a 10% buffer. I had a spot communicator, a backup battery, a first aid kit that I had assembled myself rather than buying prepackaged because prepackaged first aid kits always had the wrong things in the wrong quantities. I had done sections of this particular stretch before. Not this exact run, but the adjacent sections, close enough that I knew the character of the terrain, the way the trail behaved, what to expect from the elevation changes that I drove up on a Tuesday, parked at the northern terminus, took the required photo of the trailhead register with my phone, signed my name and my intended route and my emergency contact, and stepped onto the trail at 7:40 in the morning. The sky was clear and cold and the leaves were turning. That October Appalachian turning that takes longer than people in the lowlands expect because the elevation keeps the temperatures lower and the color cycle runs behind the calendar. The air had a specific smell, the combination of cold and decay and something underneath the decay that is the smell of things still actively living in the presence of cold, the smell of the forest doing its work. I felt, stepping onto the trail, better than I had felt in months. Not good, but better. The specific better of a body in appropriate motion in an appropriate environment. All the parts of a person that evolved to move through landscape, finally moving through landscape. The first day was ordinary in every way I needed it to be ordinary. I covered 15 miles by early afternoon, which was a reasonable first day pace given the elevation changes on that section. Set up camp near a water source I'd identified in the planning stage, made a hot meal, and ate it while the sun finished going down, hung my food bag, and did my camp chores with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done them many times, and was in my sleeping bag by 9. I lay there in the dark listening to the creek, which was loud enough to fill the silence completely, and I thought about my father. About the way he had said once, when I was maybe 9 or 10, and we were on a drive through a mountain stretch of highway in Virginia, that certain places had a way of holding people. Not trapping, holding. The distinction had felt important to him. He said it the way he said things he'd been working out for a long time, carefully, with the specific satisfaction of having found the right word after a long search for it. I fell asleep thinking about that. The difference between holding and trapping. I didn't know then that I would spend the next 11 days trying to understand the distinction firsthand. The second day began with fog, which was common for that time of year and that elevation, the dense low fog that collects in the valleys overnight and burns off by mid-morning, and I moved through it slowly and carefully, staying close to the trail markings because in heavy fog on unfamiliar terrain, you can lose the trail faster than you'd think, and the consequences on a solo hike can go from inconvenient to serious very quickly. By 9, the fog had thinned enough to move at a normal pace, and by 10 it was gone. The sky overhead clear and very blue in the way that Appalachian October sky is blue, a blue that has more depth than summer sky. That seems further away. It was around 10 that I noticed the first thing. I want to be precise about how I noticed it because the way you notice things on the trail is different from how you notice things in ordinary life. On the trail, especially solo, especially after several days of sustained walking, The conscious mind quiets down and something else takes over, something more like scanning, like the baseline alertness of a creature that lives outdoors, and it notices things at the edge of awareness and files them without immediately presenting them for interpretation. So when I say I noticed, I mean I registered something, cataloged it, and kept moving. What I noticed was that the shelter I was approaching was appearing earlier than it should have, that I had marked the shelters on my annotated maps before leaving. The distances between them verified against 3 different sources. The shelter I was heading for, the Ridgeline Shelter, was at mile 22 of my route, approximately 6 miles from my campsite of the previous night. I had been walking for 2 hours and 40 minutes. At my typical pace on the terrain of that section, I would have covered approximately 8 miles, maybe 9 with the favorable grade I'd had that morning. The shelter was showing at mile 22. I stopped and checked my GPS. My GPS said I was at mile 22. I sat on the edge of the shelter platform and checked my maps. The shelter was labeled correctly. The water source side trail went the same direction my map indicated. The surrounding terrain matched. I ate half a granola bar and drank from my water bottle and did the math several times. The only explanation that fit was that I had somehow covered 15 miles in less than 3 hours, a pace physically impossible with the weight I was carrying on that grade. Or my GPS was wrong about how far I'd come, or my maps were wrong about where the shelter was. I finished my granola bar and filed the discrepancy in the part of my mind where I put things that needed resolution but not immediate action. Then I kept walking. The second thing happened in the early afternoon. I was on a ridge section, a long straight stretch with good sight lines ahead, the kind of section that gives a solo hiker a pleasant sense of legibility, of being able to see the terrain ahead and prepare for it. I could see the trail stretching north in front of me for close to a quarter mile before it bent around a rocky outcropping and disappeared from view. And about 300 meters ahead, I could see a figure on the trail. A hiker, southbound, moving toward me at a good pace, with a bright orange pack cover that was visible from that distance against the gray-brown of the late October forest. A southbound hiker in that section in mid-October was not unusual. The trail sees reduced traffic in late season, but not no traffic. I watched the figure as I walked toward it. It was moving steadily, arms swinging in that trail hiker rhythm that becomes automatic after the first few days. I calculated we would meet in about 4 minutes. I was preparing, in the automatic way of solo hikers who've learned to treat trail meetings as information exchange opportunities, to ask about conditions to the south, whether there were any water source issues, any blowdowns from recent weather. I had my questions ready. I reached the point where the figure should have been, and there was no one there. I stopped and looked in both directions. The trail was empty north and south. The trees on both sides of the trail were not dense enough at that point to have concealed someone quickly. There was no side trail, no obvious off-trail route, nothing that would explain where a person visible at 300 meters had gone in the minute or so it took me to reach that point. I stood in the middle of the trail and I looked and I listened, and there was nothing. Just the wind and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself he'd stepped off to take care of something private. That hikers do that, step quickly into the trees, and that I'd misjudged the timing. I told myself a lot of things. I had gotten good at that already, and I had barely been on the trail for a day and a half. I kept walking. That night, I camped near a section of stream that sounded different from the stream I'd been tracking on my map. Not wrong, exactly. Different. The sound of it had a quality I hadn't noticed in Appalachian streams before, a particular rhythm to the water moving over the rocks that had something of intention in it, or seemed to, the way sounds seem to have intention late at night when the mind is tired and looking for patterns. I lay in my bag and listened to it for a long time and thought about my father again, about what he had said about certain places holding people, and about the way he had seemed to know things about the interior life of landscapes the way some people seem to know things about the interior lives of other people. A perceptiveness that didn't explain itself in terms of anything he'd read or been taught, but seemed to come from something more direct than that. He had told me once, near the end, when he was already sick and the medication was making him more open about things he'd previously kept internal, that there were places in the Appalachians that he would never go. Not because they were dangerous in the conventional sense. He specified that. Not dangerous, but demanding. He said that word with a care that made me pay attention. Demanding in the way that a difficult relationship is demanding, where the engagement required of you is total and the cost of not meeting that demand is not punishment exactly, but a kind of reorientation that you don't come back from the same way you went in. I had thought it was the medication talking, or the loosening that comes at the end of things, when the mind releases its grip on the ordinary categories. I had held the words, but not given them weight. I was starting to give them weight. Day 3 began with the shelter appearing again. I want to be extremely precise about this, because it is the central fact of what I experienced, the one I have returned to most often in the years since, the one that I have the most trouble assigning a category. I woke at 5:30, packed in the dark with my headlamp, and was moving by 6. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. I was moving north. I had, according to my calculation, approximately 6 miles of trail between my camp and the next shelter, the one after Ridgeline, which my maps labeled as the Spruce Gap Shelter. The Ridgeline shelter was behind me. To the south. I walked for 2 hours. I was moving steadily, not rushing. The trail was clear, the grade was manageable. The light had fully come up by 7, and I was moving through good Appalachian morning, the kind that looks and smells like nothing else on earth. That particular combination of cold and color and the sound of birds doing their first hour of the day. I felt present in a way I hadn't in months. The grief was not gone, but it was quieter, the way pain gets quiet when the body is fully engaged in something else, still there, but located rather than ambient, contained to its actual dimension rather than spread through everything. At 8:15, I came around a bend in the trail, and there was the Ridgeline Shelter. I knew it was the Ridgeline Shelter because the sign said Ridgeline Shelter. I knew it was the same shelter I had visited yesterday because the names carved into the wood of the back wall were the same names I had photographed, for a reason I couldn't entirely articulate, the previous day. I knew it was in the wrong place because my GPS said I was at mile 22 and I had camped at mile 25 and I had been walking north for 2 hours. I checked my GPS 3 times. I walked around the shelter and then walked 50 meters north of it and checked my GPS again. Mile 22, each time. I turned around and walked 50 meters south and checked again. Mile 22. I stood in front of that shelter for close to 10 minutes. I was not panicking. I want to be clear about that. I was doing the thing I always did when something was wrong, which was to be very still and let my mind work through it without forcing it. I had the physical sensation that comes with confronting something your worldview doesn't have a clean slot for, a kind of internal recalibration, the mind trying to figure out which of its assumptions to revise. The most obvious explanation was a GPS malfunction, a malfunction of a specific and unusual kind, where the device was displaying incorrect location data without displaying an error, without any indication of failure. I had never seen a GPS do that. I had heard it was possible in extreme magnetic anomaly conditions. The Appalachians were not known for extreme magnetic anomaly conditions. The other explanations I had were less tidy. I looked at the names carved in the wood again. Beside one of the names, which had been carved recently enough that the wood was still light inside the cut, someone had added a date. The date was from 7 years ago. Beside it, in smaller letters, still here. I took a picture of that too. Then I kept walking. The afternoon of day 3 was when I met the couple. A man and a woman, maybe early 50s, wearing matching rain jackets in a shade of blue that registered as too bright for the surroundings, the kind of technical blue that belongs in a gear catalog rather than in a forest in late October. They were heading south, which made sense. We exchanged the standard trail greeting, the mutual assessment of pack weight and pace that hikers do automatically, and I asked them about conditions to the south, about the shelter I'd apparently already been to twice. The man said the shelter was about 2 miles behind me, south of where we were standing. The woman nodded once without making eye contact, and then looked back at the trail ahead of her. I thanked them, and we parted, and I kept walking north. I did not think much about them for the next 45 minutes. I was working through the shelter problem, running the explanations in a loop, checking each one for structural integrity. GPS malfunction. Map error. My own misreading of the distance from my campsite. Each one failed in a specific way. A GPS malfunction of the type I'd experienced doesn't produce consistent wrong readings across multiple checks. A map error significant enough to put a shelter 3 miles from its actual position would have been caught by the 3 sources I'd used in my planning. My own misreading was the most appealing explanation and the hardest to definitively disprove, which was exactly why I was suspicious of it. At the 45-minute mark, I looked back along the trail. The way you do when you're thinking and you want to give your eyes something to do. The trail ran straight behind me for about 200 meters before bending right. And at the bend, just entering the straight section, were the couple in the matching blue jackets. Heading south. Still heading south. At what appeared to be the same pace they'd been moving when I'd passed them. I watched them for a moment. They covered the 200 meters. They passed the point where I'd been standing when we'd spoken. They did not look up. They continued south and disappeared around the next bend. The thing about that image that has stayed with me, that I still turn over, is not that they were behind me when they should have been ahead of me. The thing that has stayed with me is the quality of their movement, the consistency of it, the way they moved as though they had been moving for a very long time in that direction and would continue moving in that direction for a very long time after, without variation, without the small adjustments and recalibrations that people make when they're navigating an environment that isn't entirely predictable. They move the way things move when movement is what they do. I kept walking. I did not look back again. That night, I checked my GPS track log, the feature that records your route as a series of position points plotted on the map, so you can see exactly where you've been. I had enough cell signal on the ridge where I'd made camp to open the app and load the data. I zoomed in and followed my route south to north, and then watched it happen again going north to south, and then again going north, and I saw the shape it made. Not a straight line. Not a series of back and forths that might suggest wrong turns. A smooth oval, elongated north to south, approximately 11 miles long and covering a specific section of trail that I could identify on the map. I had traced the oval 3 times according to the data. I stared at the map for a long time. The cell signal dropped. When I reopened the app, the track log had cleared. I have no technical explanation for why a track log clears itself. I know what I saw before it did. I made my food that night and ate it without tasting it, and sat for a long time in the door of my tent with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark, listening to the forest. And for the first time on that trip, I heard the quality I mentioned earlier, the quality I have a hard time naming without it sounding like something other than what it was. The forest at night is full of sound. Small sounds, medium sounds, the occasional large sound of something falling or something large moving through brush. But underneath all of those sounds, there is a quality, a texture to the night air that you could describe as the forest breathing, existing, being present with itself. That quality was there, but alongside it, or threaded through it, or beneath it, was another quality, the quality of being observed. Not threatened, not hunted, observed. The specific weight of attention that has been extended in your direction, calmly, without urgency, with something that might be called patience. I closed the tent and turned on my headlamp and looked at my maps until I fell asleep. Day 4, I made the decision I mentioned earlier, the decision to simply collect data without forcing interpretation. To observe and record and not try to make the observations cohere into a story before I had enough of them. I had a small notebook I carried for trip notes, and I started using it for this new purpose. By noon, I had written 7 items. The blazed tree I had definitely passed before, identified by a specific broken branch hanging below it at a distinctive angle. A spring that appeared on my map marked as seasonal and dry in late October, but was running clear and fast when I reached it, cold enough that I stopped and filtered a full liter, because water sources that wrong about the season are not to be passed up on a trail. A section of trail where the substrate changed in a way that didn't correlate with any topographic feature I could see, shifting from the packed soil and leaf litter that was standard for that trail to a hard white clay that held boot prints perfectly and was covered in them. Too many to count, overlapping in multiple directions, a density of prints that didn't square with the traffic levels for that section in late October. A bird that called from the same tree, or what appeared to be the same tree, twice in 30 minutes despite the fact that I had walked a half mile between the 2 sightings. My water filter, working at approximately a quarter of its normal speed without any visible blockage. My own mood, which had shifted over the course of the morning from the manageable grief I'd started the trip with to something else, something with a slightly different texture, more anticipatory, more alert, as though some part of me had decided that whatever was happening required a different mode of operation than grief. And the 7th item was the GPS noon reading, 0 miles from my morning camp that I had been walking for 6 hours. The GPS said I was in the same place I had woken up. I knelt down in the middle of the trail, and I watched the location dot on the screen for 4 minutes without moving. The dot did not move. I stood up and walked 20 steps north and checked again. The dot had not moved. I turned around and walked 20 steps south, back past the point where I'd been kneeling. Checked. The dot was in the same place. Same coordinates, same position, the little blue circle sitting motionless on the map regardless of what. My grandmother left me the cabin because no one else would take it. But that's not the way my aunt phrased it when she called to tell me about the will. She said that grandmother had always felt a special connection with me, that she appreciated my interest in the family history, that the cabin was a meaningful piece of that history, and she'd wanted it to go to someone who would value it. My aunt said all of those things in the careful tone of someone reading from a script they'd prepared in advance. And then there was a pause on the line, and she said, in a different tone, the tone of someone setting the script down, that the cabin had been offered to each of my 3 cousins first, and each of them had declined without giving a specific reason. And that my uncle, who was the one who had managed the property taxes and the occasional inspection trip for the past 11 years since my grandfather died, had told her in no uncertain terms that if the cabin came to him, he would sell it immediately for whatever he could get. He had said it the way you say things you've decided about a long time ago. Not with drama. With finality that I said I'd take it. I said it without thinking because I had learned in my late 20s that the decisions you make before you think about them are sometimes more honest than the ones you deliberate over. My gut said yes before my mind had organized its objections. My mind's objections, when they arrived, were the standard ones for a 29-year-old with a decent salary and no particular attachment to the western North Carolina mountains, and no practical use for an 800-square-foot cabin built in 1951 on 42 acres of ridge and hollow with no cell service, a gravel road that was reportedly impassable in winter, and a well that had tested for iron contamination 3 separate times. None of those objections felt as real as the yes had felt. So I took it. I drove down from Ohio in late September, a Friday, leaving after work and pushing straight through to make the most of the weekend. The drive was 9 hours with the stop I made outside Knoxville for gas and bad coffee, and I pulled onto the gravel road that led to the cabin a few minutes after 2 in the morning, moving slowly because the road was exactly as described, deeply rutted and narrowed on both sides by overgrowth that scraped the sides of my car like something testing how I'd react. My headlights found the cabin at the end of the road, and I sat in the car for a moment with the engine running and looked at it through the windshield. It looked the way old things look when they've been maintained without being improved. The boards were the same boards from 1951, weathered to a specific gray that wasn't quite silver and wasn't quite brown, patched in places with newer boards that hadn't yet caught up to the color of the originals. Those patches showing up lighter and newer and slightly incongruous, like words added to a sentence in a different typeface. The porch ran the full width of the front and sagged slightly in the middle in the way of porches that have absorbed 70 years of Appalachian weather and are still there to talk about it. The windows were dark. The door had a padlock, the combination of which was written on an index card in my wallet in my aunt's handwriting. The whole structure had the quality of something that had been waiting, not the waiting of emptiness, but the waiting of dormancy, of a thing that had been present and inhabited and was temporarily neither, and knew it was temporarily neither. That I turned off the engine and got out. The night was clear and very cold and very loud with insects, the late-season insect sound that is somehow more urgent than summer insects, as though something in the density of it reflects the knowledge that it is ending. I stood next to my car and let my eyes adjust and listen to the hollow. Because that was the setting I need to describe before I describe anything else about what happened. The cabin sat at the lower end of a hollow, a long narrow valley carved between 2 ridges, oriented northeast to southwest, approximately 1.5 miles long and maybe 1/4 mile wide at its widest point. The creek ran along the southern edge of the hollow floor, audible from the cabin at night and invisible during the day unless you walked down to it, hidden beneath the rhododendron thickets that lined its banks in dense tangles that in summer were close to impenetrable. The ridges on both sides were forested to the top, the north ridge steeper and rockier and holding its trees less densely, the south ridge more gradual and more heavily wooded, the kind of dense mixed hardwood that in late September was just beginning to show color along the uppermost margin where the nights were coldest. From the cabin, you could see the whole length of the hollow looking northeast and a lesser portion looking southwest, where the hollow bent slightly and the tree line closed in. Earlier, standing there at 2 in the morning with the engine cooling behind me and the insects filling the dark with their late sound, I had the distinct impression of being inside something. Not an enclosed space, not a trap, but a container, a place with a shape to it, a defined perimeter, a within and a without. And the quality of the within, standing there in the dark before I'd been in the cabin or spoken to anyone who'd been there, was the quality of a place that had been itself for a very long time. I went inside. I didn't spend time on the outside that first night. I found the combination padlock, got it open on the third try, and went in with my flashlight because my aunt had said the electricity was on, but the breaker box was at the back of the cabin and the switches in the rooms would be useless until I'd been back there. I found the box. I flipped the main breaker. The single overhead bulb in the main room came on, and I stood in the yellow light of it and looked at what my grandmother had left me. The cabin was one main room with a kitchen along the back wall and a wood stove in the corner, and 2 smaller rooms off the back that were used for sleeping. The larger one my grandparents' room, and the smaller one that had always been referred to as the children's room, despite the fact that neither of my grandparents' 2 children, my mother and my aunt, had been children for several decades. There was a bathroom that had been added at some point in the 60s. In addition, you could still see the seam of where it attached to the original structure, slightly misaligned in a way that bothered a specific part of my brain every time I looked at it for the next several days. The furniture was the furniture my grandparents had had in the cabin for as long as I could remember from the 3 childhood visits I'd made. The same green plaid couch with the cushion that had always sat slightly wrong, the same iron-framed bed in the big room, the same kitchen table with the one chair that rocked because a leg had been repaired imperfectly at some point in the past and had never been fixed again. The walls had the photographs I remembered, the same ones, in the same places, the black and white photographs of people I could identify now, in my late 20s, better than I'd been able to as a child. Their faces now legible to me in the way that family faces become legible after you've watched them long enough through enough years that I looked at those photographs for a while. My grandmother's parents, her grandparents, the generations of that family going back in this specific place, on this specific piece of land in this specific hollow, further back than the photographs went and further back than I could verify. People whose names I knew from the family history my grandmother had assembled in a series of composition books that were stacked on the shelf above the wood stove. The stack I had read pieces of on those childhood visits. The familiar cramped handwriting filling page after page with names and dates and the occasional story. The kind of family history that is more list than narrative, but that has, if you read it in the right mood, the quality of a record, of a people taking care to leave. Evidence of having been present. I pulled the top composition book from the stack and sat on the green plaid couch and read for a while. I had read this one before, or parts of it, but reading it in the cabin for the first time as the owner of the cabin was different from reading it as a grandchild visiting for a long weekend. The names were the same. The dates were the same, but they had a weight now they hadn't had before. This was the record of the people who had lived in the place where I was sitting, a place I now owned, and the continuity between them and me felt not abstract but physical. The way the continuity between a river and its source is not abstract, is the same water moving. I read until 3:30, and then I put the book down and went to bed. I lay in my grandparents' iron-framed bed in the dark and listened to the hollow and fell asleep faster than I expected to, which I attributed to the 9-hour drive and the lateness of the hour. I didn't attribute it to anything else at the time. That I had 2 days before I needed to drive back. I spent the first morning walking the property, which was a thing I'd been meaning to do for years, to understand what 42 acres of western North Carolina ridge and hollow actually felt like under your feet. I started at the cabin and walked the hollow floor northeast, following the general direction of the creek without staying close to it, because the rhododendron made that impractical, threading through the hardwoods with the specific pleasure of someone walking land that belongs to them for the first time. The morning was clear and very bright, the light coming down through the canopy at a low angle and illuminating the first color in the leaves, the yellows and early oranges, and the particular burgundy of sourwood, which turns before almost anything else, and which my grandmother had always called the first word of fall. The upper end of the hollow, where the terrain began to rise toward the northeast ridge, I found what I had been told about but never actually seen, the old home place. Not the 1951 cabin, but the structure that had preceded it, or what remained of it, which was a stone foundation approximately 20 by 30 feet, the stones still fitting together with a precision that was remarkable for something built without mortar in a time before the current cabin, which my grandmother had told me was sometime in the late 1800s, though she'd never been precise about the date. The foundation was full of tree growth, a dense cluster of young trees, mostly tulip poplar, growing up from inside the rectangle of stone, using the accumulated decades of leaf debris inside the foundation as their seedbed, growing now 15 and 20 feet tall and bending slightly inward toward each other above the open center, forming something like a vault. I stood at the edge of the foundation and looked in at those trees and at the light coming through them from above, and I had the feeling of standing at the edge of a space that was occupied in some way I couldn't articulate. Not a threatening feeling. The feeling of being on the threshold of something that had its own interior logic. I didn't go inside. I stood at the edge for several minutes, and then I turned and walked back toward the cabin. That afternoon, I went through the composition books more carefully. I had 3 hours before I needed to start dinner, and I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of them and worked through them in order, oldest to newest, trying to build a chronological picture of the family's relationship to this hollow that went beyond the names and dates I'd absorbed in childhood. What I found was that my grandmother was a better historian than I'd given her credit for. She hadn't just recorded names and dates. She had recorded, with a care that I appreciated more the further I read, the things the family had believed and practiced and passed down. The rules of living in the hollow that had been, by the evidence of the composition books, maintained across generations with the consistency and seriousness of things that had been tested and found necessary. The first rule was about the upper end of the hollow. You did not go above the old home place foundation after dark. That was stated plainly, without elaboration, in the oldest of the composition books, written in a hand that predated my grandmother's, which I understood to mean she'd copied it from an earlier source. You did not go above the old foundation after dark. The entry below it, in the same hand, said simply, the ones who did not come back the same. No further detail. The second rule was about the creek. You did not drink from the creek directly. You used the well for drinking and the creek for other purposes. This one had a practical explanation attached to it. Something about the iron in the water further up the hollow, getting into the creek above the spring that fed the well, and I had understood this one as purely practical until I read the addendum my grandmother had added in her own hand, much later, which said, not only the iron. The taste of the creek changes upstream of the old place. Daddy said it changed when he was young, and his daddy said the same. The third rule was the one that stopped me. You did not call out in the hollow after dark. You did not stand on the porch and call out in a carrying voice after sunset. If you needed to communicate between the cabin and the outbuildings after dark, you used a lantern signal, 2 flashes for come inside, 3 for emergency, 1 for everything is fine. This system was described in the composition books with the matter-of-fact specificity of something that had been in use for a long time, that had been refined through practice, that had the weight of collective knowledge behind it, and my grandmother had added a note to this one too. In her cramped handwriting, the handwriting I knew from birthday cards and grocery lists, she had written, I called out once, the fall I was 16. I called for Daddy from the porch, must have been 8 or 9 at night, because I thought I saw him on the far side of the garden. I called twice. Something answered from the upper end of the hollow. Not Daddy. Daddy was inside. He came out when he heard me call, and he found me on the porch still looking at the thing at the upper end of the hollow, and he put his hands over my ears and walked me inside, and he never spoke about it after. Neither did I, until now. I sat at the kitchen table with that composition book open to that entry and the afternoon light coming through the windows, and I held that very still. The feeling I had was not fear. It was the feeling of a piece of information arriving that reorganizes other pieces of information you already had. The specific cognitive sensation of a framework shifting to accommodate a new fact. I thought about the way my grandmother had always, when we visited as children, called us inside at dusk with a quiet urgency that I had attributed to her practical nature, to the normal caution of an older person managing small children in an outdoor environment. I thought about the fact that I had never, in 3 childhood visits, heard her call out across the yard or across the hollow in any kind of carrying voice. She had always communicated at close range, in a normal speaking tone, or she had come to where you were. I thought about the iron-framed bed in the room behind me, and the fact that the window above it that faced the upper end of the hollow had a wooden shutter on the inside that fastened with a latch, and that the shutter had always been latched when I visited, so routinely that I had never thought to ask about it. I latched that shutter before dark. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to pretend I read those notes and thought about the shutter and then left it unlatched. I latched it. I also did not go out on the porch after dark that night. I told myself I was respecting the family's practices, that these were the rules of the place, and that honoring them was a form of honoring the people who had developed them. I told myself it didn't mean I believed anything in particular. I made a fire in the wood stove and heated the soup I'd brought, and ate it at the kitchen table reading the rest of the composition books, and by 9:30 I was in at some point in the night. I heard something at the upper end of the hollow that I need to try to describe this accurately, because the way I describe it matters to whether you understand what I mean. I had been asleep. I woke cleanly, without confusion, the way you wake when something specific has woken you rather than the alarm or a natural sleep cycle completion. The wood stove had died down and the room was cold, which put the time at somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. The window over the bed had the shutter latched. The other window, the one that faced the southwest, down the hollow, was unshuttered, and through it I could see the lower portion of the hollow in the ambient light of a clear night with a half moon, the pale shapes of the nearer trees, the line of the garden fence, the dark mass of the woodshed. That I lay still and listened. And after a moment I heard it again. What I heard was a voice, a human voice, or something close enough to a human voice that in the first second of hearing it my mind categorized it as one, and then in the next several seconds began to revise that categorization in ways it found uncomfortable. The voice was at the upper end of the hollow, which meant it was coming from the direction of the old home place foundation, which was perhaps 250 meters from the cabin. At that distance, at that hour, in the stillness of the hollow with the insects gone and only the creek as background, the voice was completely audible, which was the first wrong thing about it. The acoustic quality of the hollow made that distance feasible, but a voice carrying from 250 meters at 2 in the morning with that clarity implied a volume that the actual sound of the voice did not suggest. The voice I was hearing was not loud. It was a normal conversational volume, but it was arriving at the cabin from 250 meters away at a clarity that required it to be much louder than it sounded. The second wrong thing was the content. I have thought about this many times, and I have landed on the word content because what I heard was not quite words. It had the cadence of words, the rhythm and spacing of a human voice making sounds that it intends as communication, but the specific units of sound that make up words were not resolving into anything I could identify as language. Any language. It was not a foreign language being spoken at a distance. It was human vocal sound organized in human speech patterns that were not quite arriving as human speech. Like a recording of speech played at a fractionally wrong speed, or speech heard through the kind of hearing loss that preserves rhythm while degrading resolution. The shape of language without its content. The third wrong thing was that the voice, or the sound, did not seem to be addressing anyone. It had none of the qualities of a person calling out across a distance. No projection, no interrogative lift, no pausing for response. It had the quality of a person speaking to someone at normal conversational range. And there was no one at the upper end of the hollow at 2 in the morning. I was certain of that. I was certain of it in the immediate, and then I was less certain of it. And then I was in the position of being uncertain of it in a way that was not comfortable. That produced the specific unease of a question you realize you cannot answer in either direction from where you're sitting. I lay in the iron-framed bed, and I did not call out. I did not go to the shuttered window and open it. I did not go to the unshuttered window. I lay still, and I listened, and after what I would estimate was 4 minutes the sound stopped. It did not trail off. It did not conclude in any way that suggested a natural ending. It stopped the way a recording stops when you cut the playback, mid-syllable, mid-breath, present, and then simply not. I lay still for a long time after it stopped. The cold room and the dark window and the sound of the creek and my own breathing. I thought about my grandmother at 16, standing on the porch and calling for her father and hearing something answer from the upper end of the hollow. I thought about the composition books and the generations of people who had lived in this hollow and developed these rules and maintained them and passed them down, not as folklore, not as superstition, but as practical operational knowledge in the way that knowing which mushrooms will kill you is practical operational knowledge. I thought about my uncle, who had managed the property for 11 years and told my aunt without elaboration that he would sell it immediately if it came to him. I thought about my 3 cousins, each of whom had declined the cabin without giving a specific reason that I understood, lying there in the dark in my grandmother's iron-framed bed, that they had all been here. That whatever came with the cabin, the rules and the hollow and the thing at the upper end that my grandmother had heard and my great-grandfather had covered her ears against, had been encountered by each of them and declined. And that I had said yes before I'd thought about it, that I also understood something else. I understood that the yes had been the right answer. I'm aware of how that sounds given the context, and I'm not entirely able to explain it. But the thing I had felt arriving at the cabin and feeling the hollow around me, the sense of being inside something that had its own interior logic, a within and a without, the sense of a place that had been itself for a very long time. That feeling was not a bad feeling. It was an honest one. The hollow was what it was. It had always been what it was. The people who had lived here had built their lives around what it was, had developed a relationship with it that was not one of fear exactly, but of respect. The respect you have for a thing that is larger than you and older than you, and that will be here after you. A thing whose nature you have learned to read accurately enough to coexist with it productively. My grandmother had lived here. Her parents had lived here. Their parents before them. None of them had left. None of them had sold. They had latched the shutters and used the lantern signals and not called out across the hollow after dark. And they had stayed that I made coffee in the morning and sat on the porch and watched the hollow in the early light. The mist was up from the creek, moving slowly in the air above the rhododendron thickets, the kind of slow-moving mist that looks like it's thinking about where it's going. The color in the leaves was further along than it had been the previous morning, which was something I'd noticed before about Appalachian fall. The way an overnight temperature drop can advance the color cycle visibly, measurably, the trees moving fast at the end toward the thing that's coming. I drank my coffee and watched the upper end of the hollow and let it look back at me, because that was the quality of it in the daylight that was different from the nighttime quality. In the daylight, it wasn't threatening. It wasn't even strange, in the way that the previous night had been strange. It was attentive. There was a watchfulness to the hollow in the morning light, the particular quality of a place where a great many things are alive and have been alive for a long time and are paying attention in the way that living things pay attention, each from within its own frame of reference, each registering the presence of an unfamiliar element with the kind of calm, steady attention that doesn't require drama to be real. I was the unfamiliar element. I had come here from Ohio with my neatly organized anxieties and my impractical shoes and my 9 hours of bad highway coffee, and I had become, in this hollow, a thing that the hollow was looking at. I could feel it without being able to explain it. And the feeling was not unwelcome. I spent the afternoon reading the last of the composition books. In the final one, the one my grandmother had been filling most recently, I found an entry that was dated from the previous winter, 7 months before her death. It was 3 pages, longer than most of her entries, written in a hand that was still precise but more effortful than her earlier writing. The letters slightly larger and more carefully formed in the way of a person for whom writing has become a deliberate physical act rather than an automatic one. I read it twice at the kitchen table and then a third time more slowly. She wrote about the cabin the way you write about a person you have loved a long time, not with sentiment exactly, but with the accuracy of long knowledge, the knowledge of a person who has watched something across decades in all its moods and conditions and weathers, and who has the specific fluency in its character that comes only from sustained presence. She wrote about the hollow and the ridges and the creek. She wrote about the old home place foundation and the families that had come before, families whose names were in the earlier composition books, and whose presence on this land went back to a time before the county that the land now sat in existed, before the roads, before most of what we think of as the settled world had reached this particular convergence of ridges. She wrote about what the hollow had been to those people, and what it had been to her and her family, and what she hoped it would be to whoever came after. And then she wrote the thing I have thought about every day since I read it. She wrote, "I know people think we are afraid of this place. My uncle thought that. He said once that we stayed because we didn't know any better, that if we had more sense we'd sell and be done with it. He was a man who thought fear and respect were the same thing, who thought that anything you couldn't control was a thing to be afraid of. But I have never been afraid of this hollow. I have been careful in it the way you are careful with anything that is larger than you and that has its own nature. The hollow has a nature. It has always had a nature. The sounds it makes and the things that move in it and the way the upper end behaves after dark. These are its nature. The same way weather is the nature of open sky. The same way a river's current is its nature. You don't fear a river for having a current. You learn the current. You learn where to cross and where not to cross, and where the good fishing is and where the bottom drops away. You learn the river. I have spent my life learning this hollow. It is the richest education I have ever had. And if there is someone after me who will stay and learn it in turn, who will not sell and not run and not lock the shutter and pretend that what's in there is not in there, I think they will come to the same understanding I have. That some places have their own awareness. Not human awareness. Not the kind that speaks in words or means you harm or wants anything from you in particular. Just the awareness of a very old thing that has been watching a very long time. That kind of awareness is not something to be afraid of. It is something to be in the presence of, carefully and honestly, for as long as you are able. I closed the composition book and I sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light for a long time without moving. The hollow was quiet outside the windows. The light was long and gold and came through the gaps in the canopy at a low angle and lay on the floor in elongated rectangles that moved very slowly as the sun moved. Somewhere down by the creek a wood thrush was singing. Late season for a wood thrush, almost past the time they're supposed to be there, but singing anyway, the fluty spiral of it coming up through the rhododendron and the air and the silence of the cabin. I thought about my grandmother. About the girl who had stood on the porch at 16 and called out and heard something answer, and had had her father cover her ears and walk her inside, and had spent the rest of her life learning what she was living with, not leaving, not pretending, staying and learning, and ultimately deciding that what she had learned was worth writing down so that whoever came next would have the benefit of it. About the life she had built in this hollow. The husband and the children and the grandchildren who had visited, and the winters she had spent here, and the falls and the springs and the decade she had kept it after my grandfather died, alone in the hollow at the end of the rutted road, checking in with family by phone and latching the shutters and not calling out in the dark. About the peace of that. About the specific kind of peace that comes from a long and clear-eyed relationship with a place that requires something of you in order to be safe in a. I pulled out my phone. No cell signal, which I'd expected. I looked at what I'd managed to save offline before the drive down. I opened my notes app and I started a new entry and I began to write down the rules. Not from the composition books. From my own observation of the previous 24 hours. What I had felt and heard and noticed and understood. I wrote for 2 hours. And at the end of it, I had the beginning of something. Not a composition book yet. Not the life's work my grandmother had produced. But the first entry in what I understood, without deciding it exactly, was going to be mine. I drove back to Ohio the next morning. I didn't want to leave. I want to be honest about that. I was scheduled to be back at work on Monday, and I was already thinking about when I could come back, how I could rearrange things, whether there was a realistic path to spending a serious portion of my time in the hollow rather than a long weekend once a season. I was already thinking about the composition books and what I had started and the continuation that was already asking to happen. On the way out, in the early morning with the mist still on the hollow and the gold light just beginning in the canopy, I stopped the car at the edge of the old homeplace foundation. I sat there with the engine running and looked at the tulip poplars growing inside the stone rectangle, their trunks pale and straight inside the old walls, their canopy bending inward from the rim. The mist was thicker in the foundation than in the surrounding forest. It moved in the still morning air with a slight, almost undetectable circulation, the slow turning of a very large and very subtle system that I did not get out of the car. I did not call out. I sat and looked and let it look back at me, and then I put the car in gear and drove out on the rutted road with the overgrowth scraping the sides, and turned onto the county road and headed north. I had the feeling, the whole drive back, the 9 hours of highway and rest stops and bad coffee, the feeling of something that was not homesickness exactly but was in the same family as homesickness, the particular ache of a person who has found a place and has had to leave it and is already counting the days back. I have been back 11 times since that September. I have filled 3 composition books. I have learned things about the hollow that I did not know before, things that confirm the earlier accounts and things that are new, things that belong to this particular moment in the hollow's history and mine. The upper end is still the upper end. The third rule still holds. I have not called out in the hollow after dark. I have not gone above the foundation at night. But the wood thrush came back in May, the first year after I inherited the place, and sang in the rhododendron for 3 weeks straight. And in October, when the sourwood turned, I sat on the porch in the morning and watched the color move down the ridges from the top, and thought about my grandmother sitting on the same porch in the same light, watching the same color move on the same ridges, generation after generation, the long accumulated presence of a family in a place, learning its nature, respecting what it required, staying. Because some places will hold you if you let them. Not trap, hold. The distinction is everything. And the only way to learn which kind of holding a place offers is to stay long enough to find out. Most people leave before they know. My family, in this hollow, for longer than the photographs in the cabin go back, had known the difference to I am trying to learn what they knew. I think I will need a long time. I think that is exactly the right amount of time. I took the night dispatch job because the hours suited a person who had stopped sleeping well. And I had stopped sleeping well for reasons I won't go into here except to say that they were the ordinary reasons. The ones that accumulate in a life that has been moving too fast in the wrong directions for too long. The reasons that don't have dramatic names, but that produce, over time, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been awake inside their own head for longer than they were built for. The night hours had become mine by default before they became mine by employment. Taking the job was a way of making the insomnia productive. A way of being somewhere that needed what I had, which was wakefulness and attention and the ability to hold a large number of moving pieces in my mind simultaneously without losing track of any of them. The company was a regional freight carrier operating out of a logistics hub in the Shenandoah Valley, servicing a corridor that ran roughly from Harrisburg in the north to Knoxville in the south, with the spine of the operation running along I-81 the whole length of that corridor and the branches extending east and west on the secondary routes that fed into it. The fleet was 42 trucks at full capacity, though we rarely ran more than 30 on any given night, the others being in maintenance or between loads or otherwise accounted for. The dispatch office was a room the size of a generous closet attached to the back of the hub building. 3 monitors showing the GPS positions of all active units on a map of the corridor, a radio console with 16 channels, a phone bank that was mostly quiet after midnight, and a coffee maker that I ran continuously from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and that was the single piece of equipment in that room. I could not have done the job without my predecessor in the role, a man named Garrett who had been doing nights for 11 years before a back problem forced him to days. Gave me a week of overlap training that was primarily about the specific personalities of the regular drivers. Not the routes, not the equipment protocols, not the regulatory documentation. He spent maybe 30 minutes on those things. He spent the rest of the week on the drivers. He knew them the way you know people you have spent thousands of hours communicating with in the dark while they are alone, and you are alone, and there is nothing between you except a radio connection and the specific intimacy that comes from that condition. He knew the way each one handled a bad weather stretch. He knew which ones would call in early if something was wrong, and which ones would push through until the wrong thing became a crisis. He knew their voices in the way that is deeper than recognition, the way you know a voice when you know the person behind it through difficulty and monotony and the long, ordinary hours of a working life. He said to me on the last day of the overlap, the day I would be doing the shift alone for the first time with him present only as backup, that the most important thing about the night run on I-81 was to know your drivers. Not their paperwork, not their safety records, their voices. He said, the road does things to people at night that the road doesn't do to them in the daytime. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, without drama or emphasis. He said the road at night, especially that stretch, especially in the valley sections where the mountains were close on both sides and the signal got complicated, produced a quality in people that the daytime didn't. A quality of interiority. Of people becoming very present with themselves in ways that they weren't when the sun was up and the traffic was normal and the world outside the cab was legible and populated. And that interiority, he said, was something you had to learn to read. Because it was the source of the information that mattered. Not the GPS coordinates, not the load weight, not the ETA calculations. The quality of a voice at 2 in the morning on a long, empty stretch of Valley Highway was where the real dispatch information lived. If you knew how to hear it, I thought it was the talk of a man who had spent too long alone with voices in the dark and had developed a philosophy to make meaning of it. I had that thought on his last day, and I filed it in the same place I file things I don't immediately know what to do with. I would come back to it within 6 weeks. The first month was a straightforward education in the mechanics of the job. There was more to it than I'd understood from the outside. The routing decisions alone, the real-time adjustments based on weather and traffic and load timing and driver hours, required a continuous low-level calculation that was more complex than it appeared, the kind of complexity that hides under the surface of a job until you're inside it. I was a person who responded well to that kind of complexity. I liked having my attention fully occupied. The nights went by faster than I expected, which was exactly what I needed from them. The hours moving with purpose rather than the heavy, purposeless movement of a 3 a.m. hour when you're awake for no reason and the thoughts come in the way they come when there's nothing to push them back. I learned the drivers at the same time. Not the way Garrett knew them, not yet, but I began to develop the initial map of personalities that the job required. There were 31 regulars on the night rotation. I'll describe a few because understanding them matters to what happened later. Marcus was the senior driver, 19 years with the company, a voice so deep and so unhurried on the radio that it was sometimes indistinguishable in the first syllable from road noise. He ran the southern stretch, Roanoke to Knoxville, as often as not, a run that took him through the most isolated sections of the corridor, the long Virginia-Tennessee border stretch where the mountains were closest to the road and the radio signal was least reliable. He was the driver Garrett had described most carefully, in the most detail, with the specific precision of someone describing a person they had come to know as well as family. He said Marcus was the most important voice to know because Marcus was the most likely to be in trouble before he said he was in trouble. There was a driver named Charisse who ran the northern section, Pennsylvania into Maryland and back, who had the habit of narrating her drive in the quiet hours, not to dispatch specifically, just into the open channel. A low, steady commentary on the road and the weather and the landscape in the dark that was not quite addressed to anyone, but that had the quality of a person who needed to hear their own voice in the silence to confirm their own presence in it. Garrett had mentioned her with a particular warmth. He said she had the best road sense of anyone on the fleet, that she called in changes in road conditions before the traffic apps detected them, that she had an instinct for the road that couldn't be taught, and that her narrations, if you listened to them carefully, were more useful than any of the official data feeds. I found that to be true within the first 2 weeks, and there was a driver whose name I will not use, who I will call only by the road name the other drivers had given him, which was 7, because he ran Route 7 more often than any other driver, and because 7 was the route that nobody else wanted, the one that branched off I-81 at Staunton and wound east into the Blue Ridge, and then back west through a series of secondary roads that were perfectly legal and perfectly rated for freight, but that had, among the driver community, a reputation that nobody ever explained in specific terms, but that everyone on the fleet seemed to share. 7 the driver had run Route 7 more times than anyone had counted. He never complained about it. He never talked about it. When he checked in at the midpoint, he gave his position and his ETA and nothing else. And when he came off Route 7 in the early morning hours, he was always exactly on time and always quiet in a way that was slightly more quiet than his baseline quiet. A quiet that had a specific texture to it, a density. The way silence has density after certain experiences that the silence before those experiences didn't have. I asked Garrett about Route 7 on the 4th day of our overlap. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, which was not his usual response time. He said the route was fine. He said the roads were fine. The surface was good. The clearances were all legal. There had never been an accident on that section. I said I knew that. I checked the records. I was asking about the reputation. He looked at me for another moment, and then he said that some roads at night were different from the same roads in the daytime, and that Route 7 was one of them, and that it ran through a section of the Blue Ridge that had a quality after dark that the drivers felt without being able to describe it, and that 7 the driver was the one person in the fleet who seemed to be not unaffected by it, but specifically calibrated for it, who could run that route in the middle of the night and come back quiet but intact. He He said he had put other drivers on Route 7 over the years, always with the option to take the alternate routing if they were uncomfortable, and that several of them had taken the alternate, and one of them had taken it 2/3 of the way through the route and had subsequently requested a transfer to a different shift in a different section of the corridor and had never, to Garrett's knowledge, explained why. I asked what had happened to that driver. Garrett said he'd transferred to day work on the eastern corridor and as far as he knew was still there. He said it in the specific way of someone communicating that the question had a boundary, and this was a. I started the solo nights in the second week of October. The leaves were turning in the valley, which you could see in the daytime when you drove in and out of the hub. The Blue Ridge on the east side of the valley going through its cycle from the top of the ridgeline down. The slow wave of color descending through the elevations the way a change descends through a system too large to change all at once. At night you couldn't see the color obviously, but you were aware of it in the other ways. The smell of it that came through the ventilation in the dispatch room when the outside air moved through, the temperature drop that came with the turn, the particular quality of the night sky in October over the valley that is different from the summer sky. Cleaner, harder, the stars more distinct and the dark between them a darker dark. The nights settled into a rhythm fast. 7 p.m. Received the shift handoff from the day dispatcher, a woman named Paula who always left me a note with any active exceptions to standard routing. 8 to 11. The active loading window, trucks coming and going from the hub, the radio busy with the short-range communications of the yard. After 11 the rhythm changed. The long-haul units were out on the corridor and the yard was quiet and the dispatch room became the thing it actually was, which was a room with 3 screens and a radio, and a person whose job was to hold the awareness of 30-some moving objects spread across 300 miles of nighttime highway, and to be there when any of them needed anything, and to anticipate when they would need something before they knew they needed it themselves. This last part was the part Garrett had tried to teach me in the overlap, and that I had thought I understood, and that I had not understood until I started doing it alone. The anticipation was not intuition, or it was not only intuition. It was the product of the same kind of accumulated knowledge that Garrett had been describing when he talked about the driver's voices, a knowledge built from the thousands of small data points that a person absorbs over time working the same corridor, the same weather patterns, the same equipment tendencies, the same stretches of road that produce the same problems in the same conditions. But it was also something more than that. It was, I came to understand over the first several weeks alone, a sensitivity to the quality of the radio silence between transmissions, the texture of no one talking, the specific weight of a channel that had been quiet for 30 minutes versus a channel that had been quiet for 30 minutes on a stretch where a unit should have checked in. The difference between a silence that meant nothing and a silence that meant something had changed. Garrett had been right. Knowing the voices was everything to be by the end of October. I knew all 31 regulars. Not the way Garrett knew them, not with 11 years of context, but in the specific way of a person who had been listening carefully for a month. I knew Marcus's voice in the particular deep, unhurried register he used when the run was going normally, and the slightly different quality it took when the weather was changing, or when the load had shifted, or when something on the truck was running at a frequency slightly off from its baseline. I knew Charissa's narrations well enough to hear the difference between her road sense narrations and her comfort narrations, the ones she did not for information but for company. I knew Seven's check-in voice, the flat, precise 2-sentence confirmations of position and ETA that were consistent to the point of being almost scripted, and I knew the quality of the silence that came after them, the silence that had, as I'd noticed in the first weeks, a texture that the silence after other drivers' check-ins didn't have. A density, a sense of something that had not been said occupying the space where it hadn't been said. The first incident happened on a Thursday night in the first week of November. 7 was on Route 7, which was not unusual. The eastern section of the Blue Ridge Run was in a weather event. Nothing severe, a band of rain and reduced visibility that my weather feed was showing moving from east to west across the ridge, and that would affect the road conditions on the secondary section of the route for 2 to 3 hours before clearing. I called 7 at the point where I would typically have given him the option to take the alternate routing around the weather, the call I'd made several times in similar conditions, and that he'd always declined without explanation or elaboration. Just a brief negative and the confirmation that he was continuing on route that I made the call. The radio returned silence. Not static. not the specific quality of signal interruption that indicated I was outside his radio range. Silence. Clean silence. The kind that means the channel is open and the receiver is live, and there is simply no response. I waited 30 seconds and called again. Silence. I noted the time and the GPS position of his unit, which showed him stationary at the point on Route 7 where the pavement changed from the county-maintained section to the older township-maintained section, a detail I had noticed on the route maps, and that the other drivers had mentioned in passing as a place where the road felt different, where the surface changed character in a way that was more significant than the visual difference between two road maintenance standards would suggest. His unit was stationary for 11 minutes. I called 3 more times in that window. No response. I was preparing to escalate, to call his cell phone, and then to call the state police non-emergency line if there was no answer, when the radio clicked and his voice came back. 2 sentences, the standard check-in format, position and ETA, delivered in the same flat, precise register I knew from every previous check-in. ETA was consistent with his having been stationary for 11 minutes and now moving normally. Position confirmed he was past the road surface change point and continuing east that I said I'd been trying to reach him. I said it in the way that was not accusatory but was informational, the way dispatch communicates concern without loading it with emotion that drivers in the middle of a long run don't need added to their cognitive load. He said there had been a signal issue. He said it in the same flat register. I noted it in the log and moved on, but after a while I started to notice small things. The first thing I noticed was that his ETA, when he next checked in, was 4 minutes later than it should have been given his position and his reported speed. Not significant on its own. Drivers made small miscalculations on ETAs all the time. The second thing was that his voice, in the check-ins that followed over the next 2 hours, had the same flat, precise register I knew, but with a quality added to it that I was having trouble locating. Something underneath the precision. Something that was not there before the 11 silent minutes. I listened to each check-in twice, using the replay function on the radio console that recorded all channel traffic, and I sat with that quality and tried to name it, and the closest I could come was this. His voice had always had the quality of someone reporting information they had already processed. The flat check-ins had always felt like the output of a person who had understood their situation and was conveying the relevant facts. The new quality was that the check-ins felt like the output of a person who was performing the understanding, who was producing the report without the internal processing that the report was supposed to represent. That I noted it, and kept listening. 2 weeks later, Marcus called in from the southern section, the stretch below Roanoke heading into the Tennessee border country, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Not distress. Marcus's voice in distress I had heard once, in my second week, when a tire had let go on a bridge section and I had talked him through the controlled stop and the protocol while waiting for road assistance. I knew what his voice sounded like under that kind of load. This was different. What I heard in his voice that night, in the call he made at 2:47 in the morning from a stretch of highway that ran through a narrow valley with the mountains very close on both sides and the road running straight for miles in the dark, was a quality I had to think about for several minutes before I could name. The quality was uncertainty, not about the road conditions or the truck or the weather, about something more fundamental than any of those things. The uncertainty of a person who has, in the course of a long night on an empty road, arrived at a question about something they had always considered settled. He said he wanted to check in. I said he was a half hour early for his scheduled check-in. He said he knew. He said he just wanted to hear a voice. The way he said it, the specific inflection on the word voice, had a weight to it that I filed immediately in the category Garrett had described. The category of things that meant something had changed that hadn't been named yet. That I said I was here. I said the road ahead was clear. The weather system that had been building on the Tennessee side was slower moving than the initial forecast and would not be in his section for another 3 hours. He would be past the worst of the elevation changes before it reached him. I gave him the information in the steady, unhurried way that I had learned produced the most useful response in drivers who had crossed from the ordinary consciousness of a long haul into the specific altered state of the deep night hours on an isolated stretch of mountain highway. And he listened, and I heard him settle, incrementally, the way you hear a structure settle when it has been under load and the load shifts. He said thanks and checked off the channel and I sat in the dispatch room and listened to the silence that came after and thought about what I'd heard. The second incident with 7 happened 3 weeks after the first. He was on Route 7 again. Different weather, no weather event this time. A clear November night with good visibility and dry roads. No reason for the 11-minute stationary period that my GPS showed at the same position on the route where the road surface changed. I did not call into the silence this time. I had thought about the first incident enough to have made a decision about the second. I waited. I monitored the GPS. His unit was stationary for 9 minutes and then began moving again, and 30 seconds later his voice came on the radio with the standard check-in, position, and ETA, flat and precise, and with the quality underneath that I had been trying to name since the first incident and that I had, in the intervening weeks, gotten closer to. The quality was this. His voice, after the stationary periods, sounded like a voice that was deciding how to sound. Like a voice that was producing the sounds of itself from a slight remove, from a position that was not quite inside the voice, not quite inside the person the voice belonged to. A position that was monitoring the production of the voice and ensuring its consistency from a place that was not the same place the voice usually came from. When you know a voice well, when you have listened to it across hundreds of hours in the dark, you know where it comes from. Not literally, but there is a quality of origin to a voice, a sense of the person it is continuous with, the body and the history and the current state of mind that the voice is the outward expression of. 7's voice, after those stationary periods on that section of Route 7, had that quality of origin slightly displaced, slightly relocated. Still his voice, still the flat, precise register, but from a position just adjacent to the position it had always come from before that I started keeping a separate log. Not the official dispatch log, which was a legal document and had no room for the kind of observations I was accumulating. A personal log, a small notebook I kept in the desk drawer under the radio console. I wrote in it during the quiet hours, recording what I was noticing, trying to build a picture that was precise enough to be useful without being shaped by the conclusion I could feel forming at the edge of my thinking, but that I wasn't ready to name. In December, Marcus stopped narrating his check-ins. I want to explain what that means because it requires context. Marcus's check-ins had never been verbose. He was not a talker the way some drivers were. But he had the habit, which I had come to rely on, of appending to his position and ETA a brief read of the road conditions, always 3 to 5 words, delivered in the same deep, unhurried register, the kind of minimum viable poetry that practical people develop for communicating significant information efficiently. Clear and cold, fog in the lower sections, road wet through the gap. These were not reportable events. They were texture, the texture of a driver who was present in his environment and registering it accurately and sharing what he registered as a matter of professional courtesy. They were also, as I had understood from the first weeks of listening, the data Garrett had told me to pay attention to. In December, Marcus stopped appending them. His check-ins became the same 2-sentence format as 7's. Position and ETA. Nothing else. I noted it in the personal log without drawing a conclusion. I called him at the next scheduled check-in and gave him the weather and the road conditions from my feeds and asked how the road felt on his end. He said it felt fine. He said it in the flat, precise way that 7 said everything. I noted that too. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next because I know how it sounds and I am not willing to describe it in a way that is more dramatic than it was or more explanatory than I am able to be. What I am able to be is accurate. I can tell you what I observed and what I concluded from what I observed, and where the conclusion stops being something I can support with evidence. The point where it stops being evidence-supported is also the point where it becomes the most important part of the story, which I am aware is a problem and which I have not been able to resolve. In January, I had noted the same quality in 9 drivers that I had first heard in 7 the previous November. 9 of my 31 regulars. Not all at once. Not in any pattern I could identify in terms of route or timing or weather conditions or any other variable I could isolate. One by one, over the span of 2 months, 9 drivers had developed the same quality in their radio voices. The quality of a voice that was deciding how to sound. The quality of origin slightly displaced. The flat precision of a report being produced from a position just adjacent to the position the voice had always occupied. The drivers were otherwise normal. Their paperwork was in order. Their loads were delivered on time. Their routes were clean. If I had not spent 4 months doing nothing but listening to their voices in the dark for 12 hours at a stretch, I would have had no basis for any of the observations in my private log. The official log was entirely clean. Nothing to report. Everything running within normal parameters. But after a while, I started to notice small things about the way they communicated with each other. The radio communications between drivers on the same section, the casual cross-channel talk that happened in the quieter hours when the road was empty and the night was long, and the drivers were people who had been on the same road for years and knew each other, and had developed the radio relationships of people who spend significant time alone in similar conditions and understand each other's solitude. This cross-channel talk was a texture of the night that I had come to depend on in a way I hadn't expected when I took the job. It was the sound of people being themselves in the dark, the ordinary, specific human texture of people who were tired and working and moving through the nighttime geography of a corridor they knew intimately, and who talked to each other the way people talk when they're not performing for anyone. The 9 drivers with the quality in their voices had stopped cross-talking. Not abruptly, gradually. Over the weeks since I'd first noticed the quality, they had pulled back from the casual channel traffic until their radio presence was purely functional, purely the check-ins, position, and ETA, nothing that was not operationally required. And the remaining 22 drivers, the ones who still had the warm, specific texture of themselves in their voices, had begun, without announcing it or referencing it, to cross-talk with each other more than before. The channel traffic in the quiet hours had not reduced. It had redistributed. The 22 were filling the space that the 9 had vacated, in a way that had the quality of something responding to an absence rather than something spontaneously generated. That I had not discussed any of this with anyone. I want to be precise about that. I had not told Paula, the day dispatcher. I had not called Garrett, who had moved to the Eastern Corridor day shift and whose number I had saved for emergencies. I had not mentioned it to the fleet manager or to any of the 9 drivers themselves, or to any of the 22 drivers who I was fairly certain were aware of something without having been told anything specific. I had kept it in the private log and in my own processing, partly because I could not construct a version of what I had observed that would sound like anything other than a dispatcher who had been working nights too long and had developed an overactive sensitivity to the texture of radio traffic. And partly because I was not sure in the way that matters when you're deciding whether to say something that cannot be unsaid, whether what I was observing was what I thought it was. The thing I thought it was, stated plainly, was this. The corridor at night was doing something to certain drivers. The I-81 corridor through the Shenandoah Valley, specifically the sections where the mountains were closest to the road, the sections where the radio signal was most complicated and the landscape was most enclosed and the night was longest and most complete, was producing a change in certain drivers. A specific change. A change in the quality of origin of their voices. A relocation of whatever it was that produced the voice from inside the driver to somewhere slightly outside the driver, or slightly alongside the driver, or slightly other than the driver in a way I don't have precise language for. A change that was consistent across 9 different people over 2 months with no common variable except the road and the night and the time spent in that specific quality of darkness that I said I wouldn't name the conclusion before the evidence could support it, and I've now arrived at the edge of what the evidence supports. So I'll say the rest of what I know as carefully as I can and leave the conclusion for you to assemble that I know that Route 7 runs through a section of the Blue Ridge that one on the fleet wanted to run, and that the one driver who ran it consistently came back from it changed in a specific and incremental way that was complete by the time I had been on the job for 3 months. That I know that the section of I-81 through the Central Valley, the section between Staunton and Roanoke where the mountains were close on both sides and the signal was complicated, produced the same change in 8 other drivers over the span of 2 months. That I know that the change was not visible in any official metric. Loads delivered, hours logged, safety record, drug tests, all clean. Whatever the road was doing to these drivers, it was not impairing their function by any measure the company tracked. That I know that in February, 6 months into my solo nights, I noticed the quality in my own voice. That I noticed it the way you notice a change in yourself that has been happening gradually, and that you have been, in some part of your awareness, tracking without wanting to acknowledge the tracking. I noticed it in the recording function. I had been reviewing the recordings of the previous night's radio traffic as part of my personal log process. working through the channels systematically, and I came to a recording of my own transmissions from the 3 a.m. hour, the hour when the corridor was quietest and the dispatching was most minimal, and I was most alone in the dispatch room with the screens and the coffee and the dark outside the windows. And I listened to my own voice, and I heard it. The quality I had been describing in the private log for 4 months, the quality of a voice deciding how to sound, of origins slightly displaced, of production from a position that was not quite inside the voice. Not quite inside the person the voice belonged to. I sat in the dispatch room at 6 in the morning with the recording playing, and I listened to my own voice, and I tried to remember what I had been thinking in the 3 a.m. hour when the transmission was recorded, and I could not locate the memory clearly. I had a general memory of the hour, the usual quality of it, but the specific thoughts I'd had and the specific state I'd been in when I'd made those transmissions were not available to me in the way that memories of the previous hour and the hour before it were available. There was a quality of gap, not amnesia, dimness. The way a room looks when the light in it is working at a level that allows you to see the shapes of things, but not their colors or their textures or their details. I had been there. I had made the transmissions. But whatever had been happening in me while I'd been, there was less present to me than it should have been, less available, less mine in the specific way that your own experience is supposed to be yours that I did not tell anyone. I drove home in the February morning with the sky going from dark to gray over the ridge, and I sat in my kitchen with the specific alertness of a person who has understood something that they cannot now ununderstand, and I thought about Garrett and the 11 years he'd spent in that room, and the back problem that had moved him to days, and whether the back problem had been the real reason, and whether he had known what I now knew and had managed it by leaving before it completed itself, and whether leaving was still an option. I stayed on nights for 4 more months. I'm not going to explain why except to say that the reasons were not simple and were not entirely rational and had something to do with the same quality that made me say yes to the cabin before I thought about it. The same instinct toward the thing that requires more of you rather than less. I kept the private log. I kept listening. I noted the changes in my own voice the way I had noted the changes in the other drivers' voices, with the same precision and the same unwillingness to describe what I was observing in terms I couldn't support. What I can support is this. The corridor at night is a specific kind of place. Not dangerous in the ordinary sense. Not dangerous in any sense that the official record would reflect. But demanding, in the way that my grandmother would have understood the word. Demanding in the way that a place with its own nature, a nature that has been accumulating over a longer time than any person working a freight corridor would ordinarily think about, demands something from the people who move through it in the quiet hours when the rest of the world is elsewhere. It asks for something, the corridor. In the deep nighttime hours on the stretches where the mountains are close and the signal is complicated and the road is empty and the dark is its own presence, it asks for something. And certain people in certain conditions give it, incrementally, without knowing they're giving it, and come back from the giving slightly changed. I left the job in June. I gave 2 weeks notice and I worked them and I trained my replacement, a young man of 24 who asked good questions and had good instincts and who I told, on his last day of overlap, that the most important thing about the night run on I-81 was to know his drivers. Not their paperwork, their voices. He nodded the same way I had nodded. He had the same expression I had probably had. The expression of a person who had heard a thing and was filing it in the place where things go when you don't yet know what they mean. I wanted to say more. I had the private log in my desk drawer and I thought about giving it to him. I thought about trying to describe what I had heard, what I had cataloged, what I had eventually heard in my own recordings. I thought about whether it would help him or whether it would only load him with an anticipation that would make him hear the wrong things. Whether knowing what to listen for was useful or whether it only shaped what you found. I left the log in the drawer. I said good luck and I meant it with a specificity I didn't explain. And I walked out of the dispatch room for the last time in the morning light, the June morning light, the valley in full leaf and the blue ridge on the east side green and dense, and the sky over it the clean hard blue of a clear summer morning. And I stood in the parking lot of the hub for a moment and let the daylight be what it was, which was ordinary and present, and everything the night hours were not. And I felt the specific relief of a person who has come back from something and is standing in the place they started from, but is aware of the return in a way they were not aware of the departure. That I still drive I-81 sometimes. Daytime hours only. I make that choice deliberately, and I make it every time, and I have never regretted making it. The road in the daytime is what a road is: infrastructure, geography, the ordinary utility of a thing built to move people and goods from one place to another efficiently. The mountains on both sides are the mountains, which are beautiful in their old, rounded, patient way, older than almost anything else in the eastern half of the continent, wearing their age in the rounded softness of ridges that have had 480 million years to settle into themselves. That I drive through the valley, and I look at the mountains, and I think about the nights, about the quality of the radio silence in the deep hours, about the voices, about the specific change that the corridor made in the people who moved through it in the dark often enough and long enough and with enough of themselves available to it to give it something to work on. And I think about what Garrett said, that the road at night does things to people that the road doesn't do in the daytime. Said without drama. Said as simple operational fact. The kind of fact you develop after 11 years of listening to voices in the dark. The kind of fact that doesn't fit cleanly in any official document, but that is true in the way that empirical facts are true, observable, consistent, reproducible under the right conditions. The right conditions being the night, and the corridor, and the particular sections where the mountains come close. And a person alone in a cab, or in a dispatch room in the deep hours when the world has contracted to the sound of a voice in the dark, and the question of whether the voice you're hearing is the same voice it was when the night began. That question, once it has presented itself clearly enough to hear, does not stop being a question just because the sun comes up. It just waits for the next time. You're alone in the dark long enough to hear it again. I had been doing land surveys for 11 years before I encountered a piece of ground that did not want to be measured. That I want to be precise about that word, want, because I am a person whose professional life is built around precision, and I don't use imprecise language casually. I'm aware that attributing intention to a landform is not the kind of statement a licensed surveyor puts in an official report. I'm aware that it sounds like the statement of a person who has been working outside in bad weather for too many seasons and has developed the kind of philosophical relationship with the natural world that overtakes people who spend enough time in it. I am also aware that it is the most accurate description I have of what happened on the Catlet Ridge survey in October of 2 years ago, and accuracy is the standard I hold myself to, professionally and otherwise. So, the ridge did not want to be measured. I will explain what I mean by that as carefully as I can, and then I will let you decide what to do with it. The job came through a title company in Knoxville that I had done work for intermittently over the previous 4 years. The legal situation was the kind that generates survey work regularly in that part of Tennessee. A property dispute between two adjacent landowners, both claiming a section of ridge that ran along their shared boundary. The dispute having proceeded far enough through the legal system to require a licensed survey to establish where the boundary actually was and had historically been. This was standard work. The kind of title dispute that produces survey jobs in the mountain counties of East Tennessee as reliably as spring rain. Because the land records in those counties are old and incomplete, and the boundaries described in them were established at a time and by methods that were accurate within the tolerances of their era, and that don't always survive contact with modern GPS and total station equipment without generating discrepancies that require professional resolution. I had resolved dozens of these discrepancies. They were the bread and butter of a rural survey practice in that region, and I was good at them. The two parcels in question were on the eastern face of a ridge in a county I will not name specifically, a ridge that ran northeast to southwest through a section of the Appalachian Highlands that had been in continuous private ownership since the original land grants of the late 18th century. The Catlet family had held the western parcel for 4 generations. The Mabry family had held the eastern parcel for 3. The dispute was over a strip of land along the ridgeline itself, approximately 800 meters in length and varying in width from 60 to 120 meters, a strip that both deeds described as belonging to their respective parcel, the Catlet deed describing the boundary as running along the eastern face of the ridgeline, and the Mabry deed describing it as running along the western face, leaving the ridgeline itself in a kind of legal ambiguity that had existed, apparently, peaceably, for decades before a timber sale proposed by the Mabry family had brought it into active contention. The ridge itself was unmapped in any precise sense. There were USGS topographic sheets covering the area, the standard 7.5-minute quadrangles, and the ridge appeared on them as a contour feature with an elevation designation and a name, Catlett Ridge, which appeared to have been applied by virtue of the family that had held the western parcel longest rather than by any formal naming process. But there had been no licensed survey of the ridgeline itself, no formal establishment of the boundary along the ridge, in the entire recorded history of both parcels. The two deeds described the same physical feature, the ridgeline, using different legal language that had been written at different times by different surveyors working from different reference points, and the question of which description was correct had been unresolved and apparently unimportant, until the timber sale made it important that I drove out to the site on a Monday morning in the second week of October, leaving Knoxville before 7 to get to the trailhead before 9. The access was through the Catlett property, which had a gravel road to a point approximately a mile below the ridge, and then a trail from there to the ridgeline. The trail well-worn enough to have been in continuous use, but narrow enough that I was carrying all my equipment in a pack and a transit case rather than running anything on wheels. I had a Trimble R10 GPS receiver, a Leica total station, a data collector, a standard surveying rod, and the reference documentation the title company had provided, which included copies of both deeds, the relevant sections of the USGS quad sheets, and a summary of the legal dispute prepared by the attorney handling the case. I also had 2 days of provisions because the access situation and the amount of ground I needed to cover made it practical to camp on or near the ridge rather than drive in and out twice. I had a permit for the camp from the Catlett family, who had been informed of the survey and had been cooperative in the way of people who believe the survey will resolve the dispute in their favor. The trail up to the ridge was an hour of steady climbing through second-growth hardwood, the kind of forest that has been logged once, maybe twice, in the last century and has come back with the specific density of regrowth. The trees close-spaced and reaching for light in a way that produced a different quality of canopy than old growth, tighter, more vertical, the understory darker because the canopy was more solid. The morning was clear and cold, the October cold that in East Tennessee has a clarity to it that summer never has, the air moving with a slight edge that kept the climb from being uncomfortable and made the view from the occasional gap in the trees sharp and far-reaching, the blue distances of the ridges layered to the west in the morning haze. I had done this kind of approach many times. I knew the specific pleasure of arriving at a working site under your own power, the way the physical effort of getting there sharpens your attention to what you find when you arrive. The ridgeline was not what I had expected from the USGS sheet. This is the first specific thing I need to describe accurately. The topographic map showed the ridgeline as a fairly standard Appalachian ridgeline feature, a linear elevated spine running northeast to southwest, the contours showing a relatively consistent elevation along the ridge crest with the expected steepening on both sides below the crest. What I found when I came up through the last section of the trail and onto the ridge was a ridgeline that had a quality the topographic map had not prepared me for. The ridge crest was narrow. Not unusually narrow in terms of the absolute width of the surface, maybe 8 to 12 meters of relatively flat ground along the top before the slope reasserted itself on either side. But the narrowness of it had a quality that the measurement didn't fully capture. The feeling of standing on the ridge was the feeling of standing on something that was defined very precisely, bounded, the way a thing is bounded when its edges are as significant as its surface. On both sides of the crest, the slope dropped away with an abruptness that made the crest feel like the top of something rather than the continuation of something, a place where two opposing things met, and the meeting was the point. The forest on the crest was older than the forest on the slopes. The trees were larger, more widely spaced, their canopy higher and less dense than the regrowth below, and they had a quality I noticed immediately and then spent some time trying to name. The quality of trees that have been in a particular place for a long time and have in some manner become appropriate to it. The way very old trees in very old places have a presence that younger trees in the same species don't. I set up my base station at a clear point on the ridge crest and began my initial observations. This is the professional process of establishing the reference framework for the survey, shooting known control points to verify the GPS receiver's accuracy, checking the total station calibration, making sure the data I would collect was reliable before I began collecting it in earnest. I had done this process hundreds of times. It takes 30 to 45 minutes under normal conditions, and produces a set of baseline numbers that everything subsequent is referenced to. The GPS observations were not behaving normally, but I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the specific nature of the abnormality matters to the story and also to my own credibility as a narrator. I am not describing a GPS failure. The receiver was functioning. The unit acquisition was normal. I had 11 satellites in view. The reported accuracy was within acceptable parameters. What I am describing is something more specific and more difficult to explain than a malfunction. The coordinates the GPS was reporting were inconsistent with each other in a way that should not have been possible given the conditions. When you set up a GPS receiver in survey mode and let it collect observations over time, the individual position readings vary around a mean. This is normal. This is the expected behavior of a system measuring to centimeter accuracy in a world that has atmospheric interference and multipath signal reflection. The spread of those individual readings around the mean is what the accuracy metric expresses. Under good conditions with a quality receiver, that spread should be tight. The readings clustered close to each other, forming a coherent picture of where you actually are. What I was seeing on my data collector was not a tight cluster. The readings were not varying around a consistent mean. They were generating a mean that was itself shifting, slowly, in a direction that had no obvious physical explanation, given that my base station was stationary on a fixed point. The coordinates were drifting. I checked the setup. I checked the receiver. I checked the satellite geometry. Everything was nominal. The drift continued. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been alarming to a non-specialist. The numbers on the screen were changing by amounts that were, in absolute terms, small. But they were changing in a consistent direction over a consistent period of time. And that kind of consistent directional drift in a stationary observation is not noise. Noise scatters randomly. This was not random. It had a direction. It had a quality of intention that I recognize as not a technical description, but that was, from the perspective of a person whose professional competence depends on being able to distinguish between noise and pattern, the most accurate description of what I was observing. I shut down the receiver, waited 10 minutes, restarted it, and began the initialization process again. The second initialization behaved normally. The readings clustered tightly around a mean, and the mean was stable. I noted the first initialization as an anomaly in my field notes, attributed it provisionally to a receiver warm-up issue I hadn't encountered before, and continued with the survey. I spent the rest of the first day establishing control points along the ridge, working northeast from my base station toward the end of the disputed strip, shooting observations at intervals and marking each control point with a survey stake and flagging tape. The work was straightforward. The terrain was manageable. The total station was performing normally, and the GPS observations were consistent throughout the afternoon. By 4 in the afternoon, I had established 9 control points along the northern half of the disputed strip and had a solid framework for the measurements I would need to make the following day. I made camp at the northern end of the ridge where a section of crest widened slightly and offered a flat surface that I'd noted on the approach, and I ate and reviewed my field notes and checked the data for anything I needed to address before morning. The data looked clean. The anomaly in the first initialization was the only irregularity in a day's worth of observations. I annotated it, processed the day's control points, and was in my sleeping bag before 9. Tired in the productive, specific way of a person who has worked hard outside all day and is comfortable with what they've accomplished. I woke at 2:15. Not gradually, not because of noise or cold or the ordinary disruptions of a night in a tent. I woke cleanly, with the specific quality of wakefulness that arrives when something external has ended a sleep cycle rather than the cycle completing on its own. I lay in the sleeping bag and listened. The ridge was quiet in the specific way of a very elevated and exposed place in the middle of the night. The wind movement audible in the canopy above the tent, the distant sound of water somewhere below on the eastern slope, the absence of insect sound, which at this elevation in October was expected. The quality of the silence was the silence of a place that was far from roads, far from settlements, in the acoustic bowl of a ridgeline with terrain dropping away on both sides. A silence that had a purity and depth to it. That lowland silence doesn't have that. I listened to the silence for several minutes, and then I heard what had woken me. Not a sound exactly. I have thought about how to describe this many times, and sound is not quite accurate. What I heard, or what I registered, was the absence of something that had been present before, a quality in the environment that had changed. As though a frequency that had been running at the edge of my awareness since I arrived on the ridge, a frequency I had not consciously registered but that had been part of the ambient texture of the place, had stopped. And the stopping of it was loud in the way that the sudden cessation of a sound you hadn't noticed is loud. Not because there is volume, but because there is a gap where something had been. I lay still and tried to locate what had changed. And after a while I understood that it was the trees. The canopy movement I had been hearing in the wind, the light friction of branches and leaves that had been continuous since I'd made camp, had stopped. Not because the wind had stopped. I could still hear the wind in the lower canopy on the slope below me. The wind was still there. But the trees on the ridge crest, the old trees I had noticed when I arrived, had gone still. They had stopped moving in the wind. That was the absence I had registered. The frequency I had been hearing without knowing I was hearing it. The specific signature of those old trees in the night wind had simply stopped. That I did not open the tent. I am noting that plainly because it is a relevant fact. I did not open the tent, and I did not look out. I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened to the stillness of the old trees in a wind that was still moving through the forest below them, and I did not move for approximately 30 minutes, at which point the canopy movement started again, gradually, in the specific way of trees that have been still and then begin to move again as the wind finds them. And the quality of the ambient sound returned to what it had been when I'd fallen asleep. And I lay there for another 20 minutes, and then I went back to sleep. In the morning, I noted it in my field notes with the same clinical language I used for the GPS anomaly. Canopy movement on ridge crest ceased for approximately 30 minutes at approximately 0215, resumed gradually. No wind cessation on lower slopes during same period. Unknown cause. I noted it because it had happened and because I record what happens. I did not have an explanation for it, and I did not manufacture one. I started the second day's work at first light, and by 8 in the morning, I was at my most southern control point from the previous day and beginning to work back toward the center of the disputed strip, filling in the measurement framework with the specific observations I needed to establish the ridge boundaries position relative to the deed descriptions. This was the detailed work, the work that required the most concentration and the most precision, the work that a survey ultimately stands or falls on. I was focused and comfortable and moving efficiently through the terrain, and then I started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first, just different enough to stay in the back of my mind. The first thing I noticed was a measurement I couldn't make add up. I had established a control point, I will call it CP7, on the previous day, and I had shot observations from it in multiple directions to verify its position. That verification had been consistent and clean. On the second day, working back through the strip and using CP7 as a backsite to orient my total station at a new instrument position, the backside observation was giving me an azimuth that was inconsistent with the position I had recorded for CP7 the previous day. Not significantly inconsistent. 11 seconds of arc, which is within the kind of error that poor setup procedure can introduce, except that I am meticulous about setup procedure, and 11 seconds of arc at the distance I was working would accumulate to a linear error that I could not absorb into my tolerances. I reset the instrument. I re-observed the backsite. Same result. I walked to CP7 and checked the stake and the flagging tape, confirmed it was where I had placed it, confirmed the prism was correctly positioned. I went back to my instrument position and observed again. Same result. 11 seconds off. I noted it and moved to the next setup position, intending to check CP7's consistency from a different direction later. At the next setup position, I had a similar issue with a different control point. Not the same magnitude of error, but the same quality. A previously established control point behaving differently in the current observation than it had in the previous day's observation, as though the point had moved, which was not possible. The stakes were physical objects driven into the ground. They did not move. I will describe what my professional mind does with observations like these, because the process is relevant. When you encounter inconsistency in survey data, you go through a systematic checklist of possible causes, starting with the most probable and working toward the less probable. Instrument error, atmospheric refraction, incorrect setup procedure, data recording error, prism position error. You work through the list and you eliminate causes one by one and you arrive at the most likely explanation. I worked through the list. I eliminated causes. I arrived at a point in the elimination process where the remaining explanations were less probable than the ones I had eliminated, and the least probable explanation of all, that the physical positions of fixed points in the ground were inconsistent with their own previous observations, was the one the data kept returning to. I told myself it was measurement error I was failing to locate. I have been in the field long enough to know that unexplained inconsistencies in survey data are almost always human error or equipment malfunction, usually the former, and that the correct response to them is systematic re-observation rather than speculation. I re-observed. The inconsistencies persisted. Not in a pattern I could identify in terms of direction or magnitude, or which control points were affected and which weren't. The data had a quality of randomness to it that was itself a kind of pattern, the randomness of a system that was operating outside whatever organizing principle my measurements were attempting to impose on it. By midday, I had re-observed 8 of my 11 second-day measurements and found inconsistencies in 5 of them. The inconsistencies were small enough that I could, with some tolerance adjustments, have produced a survey document that would have passed review. I want to be honest about that. The numbers were not so far wrong that the product was worthless. But I knew. The specific professional knowledge of a person who has been doing this work for 11 years and who knows the difference between data that is accurate within its stated tolerance and data that has been adjusted to fit within a tolerance it does not honestly occupy. I knew the data was not right in a way I could not explain through any of the standard causes. I took my lunch break on a section of the ridge crest where the old trees were largest, 3 large white oaks that had been there long. Enough for their root systems to have altered the ground around them in the visible way of very old trees. The ground raised and ridged around the base with roots that ran far and deep, the bark deeply furrowed, the crown spreading in the unhurried way of trees that have had enough time and enough space to reach their full expression. I sat with my back against the largest of them and ate and looked out at the eastern view, which was the full scope of the Appalachian highland to the east, ridge after ridge in the clear October air, the blue distances layered to the horizon and beyond. It was one of the better views I had from any survey site in 11 years of working this region, and sitting there with my back against the old oak and the eastern view in front of me and my data collector in my lap, showing me the numbers I couldn't make consistent, I had a thought that I did not want to have and that I have not been fully able to dismiss since. The thought was this: the ridge knew what I was doing, and it was not cooperating. I have said I don't use imprecise language carelessly. I also don't report thoughts I would prefer not to have had as though I endorsed them. What I can say is that the thought arrived with the specific quality of a thought that fits something you have been observing, the way a key fits a lock, the small mechanical satisfaction of a thing being recognized. Not the satisfaction of an explanation, more the satisfaction of an acknowledgement. As though the thought was not an interpretation of what was happening, but a recognition of something that had been the case since I arrived on the ridge, and that I had been resisting naming. I sat with the oak at my back, and I thought about the land grants in the title company's file. The original surveys of these parcels dated to the late 1700s, the earliest land grants in East Tennessee. The work of surveyors who had measured this ridge with chains and compasses in the years when the measurement of land in this region was a new thing, a thing being imposed on a landscape that had not previously been organized by human systems of legal description. Those surveys were rough by modern standards. They were accurate within the tolerances of their methods and their era. But they had produced a set of documents that had governed this land for 2.5 centuries, and in all of that time, across all of the transactions and disputes and divisions and inheritances that 2.5 centuries of land ownership generated, no one had ever successfully produced a precise survey of the ridgeline itself. The chain surveys had approached it and described it in general terms. The modern GPS surveys that the title company had commissioned before mine had produced the inconsistencies that had made the case litigious in the first place. And now my survey, with a quality receiver and a calibrated total station and 11 years of professional experience, was producing data that would not close to the tolerances I held myself to. I was not the first surveyor to have trouble with this ridge. I understood that sitting there, and it was a specific kind of understanding, the understanding that arrives when a pattern you've been looking at resolves into something larger than the specific instance you've been examining. The ridge had resisted precise measurement before me. It was resisting it now. And the consistency of that resistance across different surveyors, different equipment, different eras, had the quality of a property of the ridge itself rather than a property of the measurement attempts that I finished my lunch and went back to work. I am a professional, and I had a job, and I had an obligation to produce the best survey I could produce with the conditions I was working in. I re-observed the inconsistent control points a second time and a third time and recorded all of the observations, noting in my field notes the number of re-observations and the persistence of the inconsistencies, creating a documented record of what I had found rather than a cleaned-up version of it. This was the right thing to do professionally, and it was also, I realized while I was doing it, a kind of response to what the ridge was doing. If the ridge was going to give me inconsistent data, I was going to record the inconsistency faithfully rather than smooth it away. I was going to let the data say what it said. The afternoon went this way. Observe, re-observe, note the inconsistency, continue. The survey was not going to be what I had expected it to be. It was going to be a record of measurement attempts and their results rather than a clean set of established positions. The title company was not going to like this. The attorneys were not going to like it. The litigating parties were certainly not going to like it. None of that was within my control. What was within my control was the accuracy of the record, and I was going to produce an accurate record of what had actually happened when I tried to measure this ridge. At T3 in the afternoon, I was at the southern end of the disputed strip, at the point where the Catlet deed description placed the beginning of the boundary line, working to establish the position of the southern corner monument. The original monument was a stone, described in the 1887 deed as a stone set in the ground marked CK on its eastern face, the CK standing for a surveyor's initials. I had found the stone. It was there, as described, partially buried by the accumulation of leaf debris and root growth over more than a century. The CK marks still legible on its eastern face, worn smooth by the same century and a half of weathering, but present. I had brushed it clean and photographed it, and was observing it as a reference point when my total station gave me a reading for its position that I did not believe. Not because the reading was dramatically wrong, because it was perfect, because it was exactly the position that the 1887 deed description required it to be, to a degree of precision that the 1887 measurement method could not have achieved. The 1887 surveyors had worked with a chain and a magnetic compass. The tolerances of those methods, in mountainous terrain, were on the order of meters, not the centimeters my total station was claiming. The position the stone should have been in, given the deed description and the limitations of the methods used to establish it, should have been approximately correct, but not exactly correct. It should have been within the tolerance of the original measurement. But the position I was observing was better than that tolerance should have allowed. It was as though the stone was positioned not where an 1887 surveyor had placed it, but where a 21st century surveyor with precise equipment would have placed it if they had known exactly where it needed to be. I observed it 4 times. The same reading each time. No inconsistency. No drift. The perfect position. I wrote it in my field notes, and I wrote next to it, in the margin, in my own handwriting, 2 words that I have not put in a field note before or since. 2 clean. I broke camp at first light the next morning and walked out to my truck and drove to Knoxville. I wrote my report over the following week. It was the most difficult survey report I have ever written, which is a statement I make with the full awareness of the 11 years of context behind it. It was difficult not because the writing was technically complex, but because I was committed to accuracy, and the accurate report was a report that described the behavior of the data without being able to explain it, that documented the inconsistencies faithfully and presented the results of my measurement efforts without the clean resolution that a survey report is supposed to deliver. I reported what I had found. I reported what I had been unable to establish. I reported the consistent inconsistencies in my control point observations and the anomaly of the 1887 corner monument position. I recommended against relying on the GPS and total station data for a definitive boundary establishment and proposed a different approach, one grounded in the historical deed descriptions and the evidence of long occupation rather than the precise measurements that the ridge appeared to be resisting. The title company was not pleased. The attorneys were not pleased. There was a phone call in which a great deal of professional and legal pressure was applied to me to produce a cleaner product, and I explained, with the patience of a person who had learned over 11 years how to explain technical limitations to non-technical professionals in legal contexts. That the data I had collected was the data that the site had produced, and that I was not in a position to report data I hadn't collected. The call ended without resolution, and I expected to receive a request to return and complete the survey under different conditions. The request did not come. I heard through the title company contacts several weeks later that both parties had agreed to a boundary settlement based on the historical evidence and the long-standing patterns of use, the kind of resolution that is sometimes available when precise measurement is not. The ridgeline, in the end, was not going to be precisely measured. The two families who had held land on either side of it for generations had arrived, through the mechanism of legal dispute and professional survey and the failure of precise measurement, at the same place they had always occupied, on either side of a line that the ridge itself seemed to have an opinion about. That I have thought about the Catlett Ridge survey many times since. Not in the way of a professional reviewing a case file, looking for the error he missed, the equipment malfunction he failed to diagnose, the procedural deviation that explains the anomalous data. I have done that review, and it does not produce an explanation. I think about it in a different way. In the way that my grandmother's composition books produced the thought about the river and its current, about learning the river rather than fearing it, about the difference between a place that traps you and a place that holds you. The ridge had been there, in its current form, for longer than human land tenure in that region. It had been measured, in various ways, since the first chain surveys of the late 18th century, and it had resisted precise measurement consistently across that entire period. It had produced, in the legal record, a history of boundary disputes and survey inconsistencies that went back to the first deed descriptions and that had never been cleanly resolved, not by any surveyor with any equipment in any conditions. The ridge had a nature, the same way my grandmother would have said the hollow had a nature. And part of its nature, a consistent and apparently fundamental part of it, was that it did not yield its precise position to human systems of measurement. That I am a surveyor. My professional purpose is to translate the physical world into numerical coordinates, to reduce landscape to data, to make legible in the language of law and geometry what the land itself expresses in rock and root and contour and the accumulated presence of the very old. Most of the time the land cooperates with this translation. Most of the time the land does not have an opinion. The Catlett Ridge has an opinion. I have the field notes to demonstrate it, the inconsistencies documented in my own handwriting, the anomalous readings and the re-observations and the margin notation that I am still the only person who has seen. Too clean. Two words that are not a technical assessment, that are something more like a recognition. The recognition of a surveyor who has spent 11 years translating landscape into numbers arriving on a ridgeline in East Tennessee in October at the limit of the translation, at the place where the language he works in runs out and the thing he is trying to describe declines to be described in it. The 1887 stone is still there. The marks on its eastern face have been there longer than anyone who might read this account has been alive. They were placed by a surveyor whose name I know from the deed and whose field notes, if they existed, I would very much like to read. I would like to know what he noted in the margins. I would like to know whether he felt what I felt, standing on the crest of that ridge in the October light with the eastern view opening to the horizon and the old trees still and the data not adding up and the ridge looking back at him with the patient attention of a thing that has been measuring him far longer and far more accurately than he will ever be able to measure it that I think he might have. I think some knowledge, the knowledge of a place that has refused to be fully known, passes not through documentation but through the act of standing in the same place and asking the same question and receiving the same answer, which is not an answer in any language you brought with you, but which is nonetheless, if you are paying the right kind of attention, completely clear. The ridge is not interested in being mapped. It has made that clear across 2.5 centuries of attempts. It will continue to make it clear to whoever comes next with better equipment and higher expectations and the same assumption that the physical world is ultimately reducible to the numerical systems we use to describe it. Some things are not reducible. Some places have been themselves too long and too completely to be captured in any coordinate system a person can carry up a trail in a pack. I know this now in the way that you know things you have encountered directly, in the field, with your own equipment, in your own field notes, in the specific, careful language of a professional record that was trying to be honest about what it found. What it found was a ridge that knew what it was, that had always known, and that was, with the patience of very old things that have outlasted every system of description ever applied to them, content to keep knowing it long after every measurement taken of it has been superseded, revised, and eventually set aside. I took the fire lookout position because I needed to be somewhere that had no memory of me. That I want to explain that carefully, because it sounds more dramatic than I mean it to. I am not describing a crisis. I am describing the specific need of a person who has spent a long time being known, being legible to the people around them in the way that people become legible to each other after years of proximity, and who has reached a point where that legibility feels less like connection and more like a description that no longer fits. The way a name that belonged to a younger version of yourself starts to feel like a label for someone else when you say it out loud. I needed a place where no one had that description of me. A place that had no prior version of me to compare me to. A place that would meet me as I currently was without the accumulated context of who I had previously been. The lookout was on a ridge in the National Forest in western North Carolina, a 70-foot air motor tower with a 14 by 14-foot cab at the top, accessed by a 2-mile trail from the nearest forest road. The position was seasonal, running from the first week of May through the end of October, 6 months of fire monitoring in the high-risk season, standard federal seasonal work, the kind of position that has become increasingly rare as remote sensing and satellite monitoring have reduced the practical need for human eyes on remote ridgelines. The tower at Harlan Station was one of the last active staffed lookouts in the district. The Forest Service kept it staffed not primarily because it was the most efficient monitoring option, but because it covered a section of the ridge where the terrain created a specific dead zone in the satellite coverage, a shadow in the remote sensing data caused by a ridgeline configuration that blocked the optimal angles, and where a single observer with a pair of binoculars and a clear sight line could still provide monitoring that no automated system could replicate. That I found the posting in February, when the winter had the specific quality of a thing that has gone on longer than it was supposed to, and that has stopped being a season and started being a condition. I applied because the description fit what I needed. Remote, solitary, 6 months, the kind of work that requires sustained attention and tolerates nothing else. The interview was a phone call. The Forest Service person I spoke with was a woman who asked practical questions about my physical fitness, my comfort with elevation and isolation, my experience with radio communications, my ability to manage the daily monitoring protocols independently. She said the position was an unusual one and that not everyone was suited to it, and that the people who were suited to it generally knew within the first 2 weeks whether they were one of them. She said there was no shame in deciding it wasn't the right fit, and that 2 previous seasonal employees had made that decision, one after 4 days and one after 11. And that both had been fine and had found other positions. She said she was telling me this not to alarm me, but to make sure I understood that the decision was mine to make, and that there was a process for making it cleanly if it came to that. I said I understood. She said she had one more thing to mention, and there was a quality in the way she said it, the slight change of register that people produce when they are about to say something they have said before and that they know will be received with more skepticism than it deserves. The register of a person delivering true information that sounds like a disclaimer. She said that the previous permanent lookout, a man named Alderman who had held the position for 9 years before his retirement the previous fall, had kept meticulous records throughout his tenure, and that those records were in the cab and were available to me as reference material. She said that Alderman had been exceptionally thorough and that his records were among the best in the district's history. And then she said that some of what he had recorded, particularly in the later years of his tenure, was of a nature that she would describe as outside the standard monitoring scope. She said it was worth reading and worth taking seriously and worth not letting it color my first impressions of the position before I had formed my own. I said I understood that too. She said good, and gave me the start date and the access information, and the call ended. I drove to the trailhead on the first Monday in May. The world in the valley still holding the last week of spring rather than the first week of summer. The leaves fully out, but still in the bright specific green of new foliage that hasn't yet darkened into its summer color. I had everything I needed for 2 weeks in a pack that was heavier than I would have preferred. The supply-resupply schedule running every 2 weeks by a Forest Service volunteer who left provisions at the trailhead for me to carry up. 2 miles of trail with a full pack in the May morning heat, climbing steadily through the hardwood forest, and then into the transition zone where the hardwoods gave way to the mixed oak and pine of the upper elevations, and the air changed temperature and quality the way air changes at elevation. Not just cooler, but cleaner, the smell of it different, the specific smell of a high-elevation ridge in early May. Resin and cold rock, and the last of the wildflowers in the understory, the tower, appeared at the top of the last switchback, and I stopped and looked at it. I had seen photographs. The photographs had given me the structure, the silver galvanized steel of the framework, the cab at the top with its windows on all 4 sides, the catwalk that ran the perimeter of the cab outside the windows, the ladder on the south face that was the only access. The photographs had not given me the quality of it in person, the way it stood on the ridge crest against the sky, the specific quality of a structure built for a single purpose in a single place and belonging to that place completely. Integrated into the ridge the way a thing integrates when it has been in one location for 70 years and the land has grown up around its footings and the weathering has given it a surface color and texture that is specific to the microclimate of this exact ridge, this exact exposure, this exact combination of wind and rain and temperature that no other location has in quite the same configuration. I stood at the base of the tower for a moment. The ridge opened to the west and south and east in the way that elevated ridges open. The view from the base already extensive, the layers of ridgeline in multiple directions, the patchwork of the forest canopy, and the clearings and the pale blue distances fading to the horizon. I could see, from the base, why a human observer on this ridge was irreplaceable for the dead zone monitoring. The sightline was complete in all the directions that mattered. From the cab, 70 feet up, it would be close to panoramic. I climbed the ladder with my pack on, which was ungainly and required more concentration than I had available for anything else, and opened the hatch in the cab floor and climbed inside and stood up and looked around at what would be my home for 6 months. The cab was 14 by 14 feet of organized minimal living. A cot against the north wall, a small propane stove and a basin and a water tank fed by the rain catchment system on the roof. A table that folded down from the east wall for eating and writing and anything else that required a horizontal surface. A bookshelf that held the monitoring references, the fire behavior manuals, the wildlife species guides, and the district protocols in their labeled binders. And, on the shelf above the cot, the thing the Forest Service woman had told me about, the logbooks. 9 years of them, 1 per season, their spines labeled in Alderman's careful block printing, the years running from the oldest on the left to the most recent on the right. The most recent one a composition book, its cover worn soft from 6 months of daily handling. The firefinder was at the center of the cab, its alidade and its ring map, and its sighting mechanism arranged over the large circle of the map table. The topographic detail of the district spread out in the circular format that the Osborne firefinder uses, the ridge on which I was standing at the center, and the surrounding terrain mapped out to the horizon in all directions. The key features labeled in the meticulous tiny print of a document that had been in service for decades and that had been updated as conditions changed, the labels in several generations of handwriting. The oldest faded nearly to illegibility, and the newest still sharp and clear. I spent the first day setting up my living arrangement and reviewing the monitoring protocols. The work of a fire lookout is, in its daily structure, simple: watch, record, report. The watching is continuous during the hours of visibility, with systematic scans of the visible terrain using the binoculars at regular intervals, supplemented by the constant background monitoring that a person develops after enough time in an elevated observation post. The peripheral awareness of a large visual field that begins to register anomalies automatically rather than requiring deliberate attention. The recording is in the daily log, weather observations, visibility conditions, any fire or smoke observations, wildlife sightings of note, anything that changes in the visual landscape. The reporting is by radio, twice daily check-ins with the district office, and any incident reports that the monitoring generates. It was the simplest work structure I had had in years, and I took to it immediately. The first week had the quality of a calibration, of a person and a place finding their relationship, the days organizing themselves around the rhythms of the ridge, the light and the weather and the wind that came up in the afternoon and dropped by evening, and the silence that came after the wind dropped. The silence that was as specific to this elevation and this ridge as the smell of the air was specific to it. By the end of the first week, I had the daily protocols running smoothly and had begun to feel the thing the Forest Service woman had described when she said the people suited to this position generally knew within 2 weeks. I was suited to it. The solitude was not empty. The work was not monotonous. The ridge had a quality of presence that I had not expected from my understanding of the position as described in the posting, a quality that was not threatening or dramatic, but that was, from the first morning watch, continuously interesting. The ridge was always doing something, weather building or clearing, light changing, wildlife moving through the visible terrain. The canopy below shifting in the wind like a surface with its own weather. There was always something to watch, and the watching was always worth doing. I started reading the logbooks at the end of the first week. I had been reserving them deliberately, wanting to form my own initial impressions of the position before reading Alderman's account of it, following the Forest Service woman's advice about not letting his records color my first impressions. I started with the first season and read forward, an hour or two each evening after the last radio check-in, working through the careful block-printed entries in chronological order. Alderman was, as the woman had said, thorough. The early logbooks were models of professional observation. His weather entries were precise and detailed, his fire observation records exact in the format the protocols required, his wildlife notes specific and informative. He wrote with the economy of a person who had found the right amount of words for each kind of observation, neither more nor less than the observation required. Reading the early years of his logs was like reading the work of a person who was very good at something and knew it, and took the proper satisfaction in doing it well. The quality of the logs changed gradually over the years, not in their professional precision, which remained consistent throughout. In something else, in the peripheral observations, the things Alderman noted that were not strictly within the monitoring scope, but that he recorded with the same care and the same apparent commitment to accuracy as the things that were. In the early years, these peripheral observations were rare, occasional, the kind of anomalous event that any careful observer working in an isolated environment would note as a matter of completeness. A weather event that behaved unusually for the ridge's documented patterns. A wildlife observation of a species not previously recorded in the district at that elevation. Small things, recorded cleanly, filed and not embellished. By the fourth year, the peripheral observations had increased in frequency. By the sixth year, they occupied as much of each daily entry as the standard monitoring content. And by the ninth year, the final year before his retirement, they had become the primary content of the log, the standard monitoring reduced to its minimum required format, and the majority of each entry given over to the observations that were outside the scope of what the district protocols asked him to record. I read the ninth-year logbook last. I read it in one sitting on the evening of my 7th day on the ridge, beginning after the final check-in and finishing sometime around midnight, and I sat in the dark cab afterward for a while, without lighting the lamp. The night outside the windows very dark and very clear, the stars at this elevation doing what stars do at elevation, which is to be more present, more numerous, the sky more dimensional, the dark between the stars a darker dark. I sat in that dark and I thought about what I had read, and I tried to be honest with myself about what I was going to do with it. What Alderman had recorded in the 9th year was a series of observations about the forest below the ridge. The forest to the north, specifically, the section of the national forest that fell below the ridge crest in the direction the dead zone monitoring faced, the section where the satellite coverage was compromised and the human observer's sightline was most valuable. He had been watching this section of forest for 9 years from the same elevated vantage point, and in the 9th year he had written, in the same careful block print he had always used, that the forest to the north was watching back. He did not mean it metaphorically, or if he did, he didn't write it that way. He wrote it in the same observational register as his weather entries and his wildlife notes, the register of a person recording what they have observed and organizing the record with precision and economy. He described, over the course of the 9th year's entries, the quality of what he was observing, the specific way the forest to the north behaved differently from the forest in the other directions, the way its canopy moved, and didn't move in relation to wind events in ways that were inconsistent with the documented wind patterns at that elevation. The way the light fell differently through it in the morning hours than the physics of the ridge orientation would predict, the way the section directly below the tower, the section he had been watching from the same position with the same binoculars for 9 years, had begun in the 9th year to produce an optical quality when viewed through the binoculars that he described as looking back. Not literally. He acknowledged the imprecision of the language, but he returned to it across multiple entries in the final months because it was, he wrote, the most accurate description he had available for what he was observing. The forest to the north was doing something that was not animal behavior, and not weather, and not any category of natural phenomenon that his 9 years of systematic observation had given him a name for. And the closest name he had was, it was paying attention to him. He wrote about it without alarm. This was what I sat with in the dark after finishing the 9th logbook. He wrote about it with the same measured tone as the rest of his record, the tone of a careful observer committed to accuracy, recording what was there without embellishment and without minimization. He had watched the forest for 9 years, and in the 9th year the forest had begun, in whatever way a forest begins something, to watch him back. He recorded this as a fact of his working life, the same way he recorded the afternoon wind pattern and the fire weather index, the same way he recorded the family of ravens that nested on the north face of the tower for 3 consecutive seasons. It was a thing that was happening, and he noted it, and he continued doing his job. His final entry in the 9th logbook was dated the last day of October, the last day of the season, the day he had packed out for the last time after 9 years on the ridge. It was longer than his usual entries. He wrote about the season and about the years preceding it, and about the ridge itself, the way you write about a place you are leaving after a long time, and that you have come to know the way you know a person, with the specific accumulated knowledge of sustained presence. The fluency of someone who has seen a thing in all its moods and conditions, and who knows the difference between its ordinary behavior and its extraordinary behavior, because they have baseline enough to measure against. He wrote about the monitoring work and about the solitude, and about what the solitude had produced in him over 9 years, the specific interior development of a person who has spent extended time alone in an elevated place with a large view. The way that combination of factors works on a person's relationship to their own thinking. He wrote about the forest to the north and about what it had taught him, and he wrote about it without explaining it, without attempting a cause or a mechanism, simply recording what he had observed and what he had concluded from it, which was this: that some places in the forest had a quality of awareness that was not reducible to any single organism or event within the forest, but that was, nonetheless, real and consistent and responsive in the way that aware things are responsive, that registered his presence and altered its behavior in relation to his presence, and that had, over the 9 years of their mutual observation, been in something he was willing to call a relationship with him. That he did not say this in the language of mysticism or of fear. He said it in the same register as everything else he had ever written in the logbooks, the register of a careful professional noting what he found and recording it faithfully for whoever came next. I lit the lamp and looked at the north window. The forest below the ridge was not visible in the dark, not even its outline. What I could see through the north window in the lamplight was the reflection of the cab interior superimposed on the dark outside, my own face and the lamp and the table and the logbooks reflected back at me by the glass, the dark outside serving as a mirror. I looked at my own face in that reflection for a moment, and then I turned the lamp down and let the dark have the window again, and I went to bed. The monitoring protocols for the first month were straightforward. The fire risk in May was lower than it would be later in the season, the spring moisture still present in the duff and the lower vegetation, the elevated risk period running from late June through September when the moisture deficit was highest and the fire weather index most dangerous. My daily watching was productive in the sense that watching from an elevated position in clear weather is always productive. The visual field constantly populated with the small and medium events of a functioning forest ecosystem, and I was developing the baseline familiarity with the view that would make anomalies legible when they presented themselves. That I watched the forest to the north the same way I watched every other section of my visual field. I had made a deliberate decision, after reading the logbooks, to approach the north section with the same observational protocol I used for every other section, and to note what I found without allowing Alderman's ninth-year entries to shape my expectations. This was the same decision I would make professionally, reading a previous survey's problematic data before conducting a new survey. You note the precedent. You take it seriously as data from a careful observer, and then you collect your own data clean, without the previous observer's conclusions loading your perception. In the first 2 weeks, I noted nothing about the North Forest that was outside the expected parameters. The canopy behavior was consistent with the wind data. The light behaved as the ridge orientation predicted. Nothing that I could honestly describe as anomalous. I wrote this in my log, noting it as my own baseline observation, noting also that Alderman's anomalous observations had not begun until late in his 4th year, by which point he had enough baseline to recognize deviation from it. 2 weeks was not enough baseline to recognize anything. I was still in the calibration phase. I noted this and continued. By June, I had found my rhythm with the job and had stopped thinking about the logbooks in a deliberate way, the way you stop thinking about something that has been absorbed into the operating framework of your understanding and no longer requires the specific attention of conscious processing. The logbooks were context. I was building my own record. The two things existed in the same space without one determining the other. The first thing I noticed was the ravens. Alderman had written about the family of ravens that nested on the north face of the tower for 3 consecutive seasons, the 6th through 8th years of his tenure. He had noted their behavior carefully, in the register he used for wildlife observations, precise and detailed. He had not claimed anything unusual about the ravens except their presence at an unusual elevation and the consistency of their return to the same nesting location across multiple seasons. He had described them with what was, between the lines of his careful prose, a clear affection, the affection of a solitary observer for the creatures that share their small world. There were no ravens documented in the 9th-year logbook. He had not noted their absence specifically. They simply were not there, and he had not written about them. The ravens arrived in the 2nd week of June, and they arrived all at once, not singly, not in the gradual way of a nesting pair establishing a territory. 3 of them appeared on the catwalk railing one morning when I came up through the hatch for the first watch. Already there, already looking at me with the specific quality of bird attention that has intelligence in it, that has the quality of being not just registering but considering. They were there when I opened the hatch, and they were not startled by the opening. They adjusted their positions on the railing with the unhurried quality of creatures who had been in this place before and knew the protocol of the hatch opening and were not concerned by it. I noted them in my log. 3 common ravens, Corvus corax, present on east catwalk railing at 0615. I noted that Alderman had documented a raven family at this location in years 6 through 8, and that none were documented in year 9. I noted that the behavior of the 3 current birds was unusually habituated to human presence. I noted it all cleanly and moved on to the first watch scan, but after a while I started to notice small things. The ravens were present on most mornings at the first watch, not every morning but most, and they had established a position that was consistently on the east or north-facing sections of the catwalk, never the south or west. This was not significant on its own. Birds establish preferred positions based on factors that have nothing to do with human interpretation. But I noticed it, and I filed it in the category of observations that were accumulating without yet having a pattern I could name. The other thing I noticed about the ravens was that they watched the North Forest the same way I watched it, not in the diffuse scanning manner of birds maintaining environmental awareness, in the specific directed attention of creatures monitoring a defined area. When I was at the firefinder or at the north window with the binoculars, the ravens were on the north railing and their attention was directed north, into the forest below the ridge in the same section that Alderman had spent his 9th year observing. When I moved to a different window, to the east or south or west, the ravens did not follow. They maintained their north-facing attention, as though we were doing the same work from slightly different positions. I wrote this in my log without drawing conclusions. Ravens are intelligent birds with complex attentional behaviors, and the observation of a shared directional focus was interesting without being unexplainable. I noted it and continued. In July, the fire weather index began to climb, and the monitoring work became more demanding, and the days took on the quality of days that require all of your attention for their full length, the kind of work days that leave you pleasantly empty at the end, without the cognitive residue of an understimulating day. The North Forest was in my visual field as it always was, but I was not giving it the specific focused attention I had been giving it in the slower weeks of May and June. I was giving it the attention appropriate to a section of my monitoring responsibility, the systematic attention of a professional scan. There was one afternoon in the third week of July when the fire weather index was at its highest for the season so far, and the afternoon wind was moving across the ridge in a way that I was monitoring closely, the kind of sustained directional wind that spreads a fire efficiently and that elevates the risk rating for the entire district. I was at the fire finder, rotating through the full 360-degree scan, moving through the south quadrant and the west and the north, and when I came to the north and brought the binoculars up to focus on the section of forest that was my primary monitoring responsibility, I saw something that I noted in my log in the following terms. Anomalous canopy behavior in north monitoring section, approximately 400 meters below ridgeline, area of approximately 2 acres. Behavior description: canopy still while surrounding canopy in active wind movement. Duration of observation: approximately 8 minutes before returning to normal movement. No visible cause. No fire or smoke indication. Weather instruments show no local wind variation. I noted it, and I noted that Alderman had described similar events in his 7th and 8th year logs. Canopy behavior inconsistent with wind conditions in the same general section of the North Forest, recorded with the same clinical language I was using, and that in his 9th year these events had become frequent enough that he stopped noting them as anomalies and started noting them as part of the baseline. I noted all of this and I continued my scan. But the quality of my attention to the north section changed after that afternoon. Not because I had decided to change it. Because something in the observation had shifted the way I held that part of the visual field. The way a change in a piece of music shifts the quality of your listening, even if you don't consciously register the change at the moment it happens. The North Forest was the same forest it had been before. The view through the binoculars was the same view. But I was looking at it differently, with the specific attention of a person who has been given a reason to look more carefully. And looking more carefully produces, in a visual field you have been inhabiting for 2 months, the specific experience of seeing things you were previously not equipped to see. Not because they weren't there. Because you hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. What I started to see, in the weeks of July and into August, was a quality in the North Forest that I had not registered before the still canopy event. A quality that I will try to describe as accurately as I can while acknowledging that the description is going to require me to use language that is more approximate than I would prefer. The forest to the north had a quality of density that was not purely physical. I can see the physical density in the canopy, the tree cover percentage, the relative darkness of the understory. This was something else. A quality of, I will use the word because it is the most accurate one I have, presence. As though the forest in that section was more present than the forest in the other sections of my visual field, not more visible, not more detailed, but more there, more itself, more in the act of being what it was in a way that registered to my awareness differently than the forest in the other directions registered. As though looking at it was not only an act of my own perception, but a participation in something mutual, a two-way attention rather than a one-way observation. That I thought about Alderman's language. Looking back, I understood now what he had been trying to describe. It was not a metaphor, and it was not a misidentification. It was an accurate description of a specific optical and perceptual quality that the north section of the forest produced when observed from this position at this elevation with the sustained attention of a monitoring rotation. It looked back, not in any way that could be isolated and measured, and put in a monitoring report that a district supervisor would receive without concern. But in the way that things look back when they have been present in a place long enough and with enough of themselves available to the looking that they have developed, through some mechanism I do not have a name for, an attention that corresponds to yours. I wrote this in my log in August, in the careful language I was developing for observations outside the standard monitoring scope. I noted that I was following Alderman's precedent in recording these observations, that they were being recorded in the same spirit as his records, with the same commitment to accuracy and the same absence of interpretive embellishment. I noted the date and the conditions and the specific quality of what I had observed, and I put the log on the shelf and went to bed. The radio check-ins with the district office were twice daily, 0700 and 1900, standard format, weather conditions, visibility, fire weather index, any observations. I had been doing these check-ins for 3 months without variation. The district officer I spoke to in the mornings was a man named Dalt who had been doing the morning radio rounds for years and who had a voice that was efficiently pleasant in the way of a professional who was good at the social dimensions of his job without being performative about them. We had developed the working shorthand of two people who talk twice a day about the same things in a defined format, the easy cadence of a professional routine that has been repeated enough times to become comfortable. In August, in the 3rd week, Dalt said something during the morning check-in that I have thought about since. He said it at the end of the standard format, after I had given the weather and the visibility and the index, in the space that occasionally accommodated brief non-standard exchanges of the kind that happen between people who have been professionally acquainted for a season. He said that he had talked to Alderman recently. He said that Alderman had asked about the Harlan Station position. He said that Alderman had asked, specifically, whether the new seasonal had started to notice the north section yet. I said that I had. Dalt said that Alderman had said he thought I would. He said it in the tone of someone delivering a message they have agreed to deliver without fully understanding its context. There was a brief pause, and then Dalt said that Alderman had also said, and this was the part he seemed least certain about how to relay, that the north section was not something to be concerned about, and that the looking back was, in Alderman's experience, benign. He said Alderman's word was benign. He said it carefully, the way you repeat a word that was chosen carefully by the person who gave it to you, and that you want to convey without substituting a different word that would change the meaning. I said to tell Alderman I appreciated that. Dalt said he would. He said take care, and I said I would, and the check-in ended, and I sat at the table in the morning light coming through the east windows, and held what had just happened for a while before I went to the first watch position. Alderman had used the word benign. 9 years on this ridge, the last year of which had been spent in what he described as a mutual awareness with the forest below, and the word he had sent back through a district radio officer to the person sitting in the cab he had occupied was benign, not harmless, which would have been the reassurance of a person who wanted to relieve anxiety. Benign, which was the characterization of a person who had observed something long enough and carefully enough to have an opinion about its nature. Benign as a medical term means present but not harmful, present and not inclined toward harm. He had not said there was nothing there. He had said what was there was benign. I thought about that word for the rest of August. I thought about it the way you think about a piece of information that arrives in precise language from a credible source, and that confirms something you had already been building toward in your own observation. I had not been frightened of the North Forest. Not in August, and not in July, and not in the first weeks when I had been reading the logbooks and absorbing Alderman's 9th-year records with whatever combination of skepticism and openness I had managed to bring to them. The quality I had been feeling, the quality I had been observing and noting in my own log and the careful language I had developed for it, was not a frightening quality. It was an attentive one, the quality of something that was aware. And aware things, in my experience, were not inherently threatening. They were significant. Being in the presence of something significant required more of you than being in the presence of something insignificant, but more was not the same as dangerous. September came, and the fire risk peaked, and the monitoring work was at its most demanding, and the days had the quality of days that leave very little room for anything else. The constant background vigilance of a fire watch at elevated risk. The awareness of the whole visual field as a system that could change status at any moment in any of its quadrants. The specific wakefulness of a job that requires you to be continuously ready for the thing you are hoping not to have to report. And in the middle of all of that, the North Forest was part of my visual field, monitored the same as every other section, swept through in the regular rotation of the watch, checked against the fire weather conditions and the wind direction and the time of day. And in the middle of all of that, the quality I had been describing since July was present, continuously, in the north section when my attention passed through it. Not distracting, not demanding. Present. There was one night in the middle of September that I need to describe separately because it is different in kind from the other observations, and because I have thought about it more than I have thought about any of the others, and because I believe it is the thing Alderman's word benign was most directly referring to. I was at the night watch position, which was the south window facing down the ridge, monitoring the lightning activity that was building in a storm cell approaching from the southwest. Lightning was the primary night risk. Dry lightning from the fast-moving convective storms that moved through the region in September, and I was at the south window with the binoculars and the incident log ready and the radio on, tracking the storm's position and keeping the lightning counter running. The storm was close enough that I could hear the thunder as a continuous low rumble with the specific quality of storm sound in the mountains, the way the ridges channel and reflect it until it loses its directional character and becomes ambient, coming from everywhere at once. And then I heard something from the north side of the cab that was not the storm. I will try to describe this accurately. What I heard was not a sound in the sense of an acoustic event I could locate and measure. It was more like the cessation of a silence that I had not known was there. The same quality I described when I talked about the canopy going still, the quality of a frequency ending. Except the reverse of that. This was a frequency beginning. A presence entering the ambient sound of the storm night that had not been present before. Not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would have woken me if I had been asleep, but present in the way that certain things are present when they want you to know they're there. I turned from the south window to the north window. The storm was behind me, and the north face of the ridge was in near total darkness, the forest below the cab invisible beyond the first 20 meters of the tower framework. I stood at the north window, and I looked into that darkness, and the darkness looked back. In the specific way I had been observing for 3 months and had developed language for, and had written in my log, and had confirmed with Alderman's word through the radio, the mutual attention of an observer and a very old, very present thing that had been paying attention from its side of the window for longer than I had been paying attention from mine. I stood at the north window for perhaps 15 minutes. The storm moved through to the northeast, and the lightning frequency dropped, and the thunder diminished, and the night became quieter in the specific way of a night that a storm has recently left, cleaner and colder and more itself. And the quality I had been standing with at the north window diminished with the storm, not abruptly but gradually. The frequency I had registered as beginning slowly returning to the absence it had been, the presence withdrawing in the unhurried way of something that has no urgency in its movements because it is not going anywhere, only becoming less accessible, less on the surface of what was out there, settling back into the depth of the forest and the accumulated years of its being there, which were very many more years than any human presence on this ridge could claim. I wrote it in my log the same way I wrote everything else. Date, time, conditions, duration, observable qualities. I noted that the quality had been consistent with what I had been observing in the north section since July, and that this was the most sustained and direct instance of it I had experienced. I noted that the quality was not alarming and that my assessment of its character was consistent with the characterization that Alderman had relayed through the district radio in August. I noted that I did not have a mechanism to propose and that I was not going to manufacture one. And I noted, in the last line of the entry, that the experience had produced in me not fear, not unease, but something I found more difficult to name, a feeling that was in the family of recognition, of something arriving that fits a space you didn't know you had, of a question you hadn't known you were asking, receiving an answer that was not in language, but that was nonetheless, in the specific way that certain answers are, completely sufficient. October came. The leaves turned on the ridge, and the views that had been green for 6 months became the red and gold and bronze of the Appalachian fall, the color moving down from the highest elevations first and working its way into the valley over the course of the month. The visual field from the cab changing every morning in ways that were, even to a person who had grown up in this region and had seen Appalachian fall every year of their life, continuously surprising. The fire risk dropped as the first frosts arrived and the moisture returned to the duff, and the fire weather index came down from its September peaks into the range where the monitoring was less vigilant and the days had more room in them. I wrote in the log. I watched the North Forest in the daily rotations and in the specific, focused way I had developed for it since July, the way that Alderman had been developing for 9 years before me, and the quality was there, present and consistent and benign. The ravens were still there most mornings, still on the east and north sections of the catwalk, still watching north. In October, in the last week of the season, I started to think about the fact that they had not been there in Alderman's 9th year, that he had documented them in years 6, 7, and 8, and that in the 9th year they were simply absent from his record, and that they had appeared in my first year, 3 of them, on the second week of June, already habituated to the hatch and the human presence in the way of birds who knew this tower, that I thought about this for several days without reaching a conclusion, and then I reached one that I will record the same way I have recorded everything else in this account, without claiming more certainty than I have, and without minimizing what I actually think. The Ravens had not been there in Alderman's 9th year, because in Alderman's 9th year Alderman had been doing what the Ravens do. He had been watching north. He had, through 9 years of careful, sustained observation, become the thing the Ravens were. The monitoring presence on the ridgeline. The eyes that faced north and paid the sustained attention that the North Forest, in some quality of its own nature that I don't have a mechanism for, required, responded to, met with its own attention. He had become that, and so the Ravens hadn't been needed. And in the first year of a new observer, before the new observer had found their way to the specific quality of attention that the North section generated and responded to, the Ravens had returned to fill the role. They would be here, I thought, until I didn't need them anymore. Until I had been here long enough and had given the North Forest enough of the right kind of attention that I had become, as Alderman had become, the monitoring presence on the ridge in the full sense of what that phrase might mean if you took it seriously, if you allowed that monitoring could be mutual, that the thing you watched could watch back, that the attention you brought to a place over a long enough time could establish something that was not yet a relationship, but was in the process of becoming one. I packed out on the last day of October. I carried everything down the 2 miles of trail in the morning light, the leaves underfoot dry and brilliant, the air clear and cold, the ridge behind me as I descended into the hardwood zone, and then the lower elevations, and I had the feeling of leaving that is different from the feeling of finishing. When you finish something, you carry it away with you as a completed object. When you leave something, you leave a part of yourself behind in it, not metaphorically, in the way that every place you have spent serious time has a version of you still present in it, still occupying the specific quality of attention you brought to it, still watching from the cab window with the binoculars and the fire finder and the logbook open on the table, and the Ravens on the north railing facing north. I turned in my equipment at the district office and signed the seasonal closeout paperwork and had the brief debriefing with the Forest Service woman who had hired me, the same one who had described Alderman's records and told me not to let them color my initial impressions. She asked how it had gone. I said it had gone well. She said, had I noticed the north section? I said I had. She looked at me in the way of a person who has asked that question before and knows what the range of answers means. And she said good, and made a note. I asked if she had been up to the tower herself. She said once, early in her career, and that she had not gone back. I asked why. She said that some things were better observed from a respectful distance, and that she was a person who knew her limitations, and that sustained close observation of things she couldn't fully understand was one of them. She said it without any particular feeling, the way you say true things about yourself that you have made peace with. I said I understood. I drove home in the October afternoon, and I thought about the next season. About the check-in call I would make in January when the seasonal postings went up. About the logbook I would start in May. About the Ravens and the North Forest and the quality of presence that was there in the dark behind the north window, and the word benign and what it meant to spend a long time in mutual attention with a thing that was very old and very present, and that did not mean you harm, but that meant you to know it was there. I have been places that had a nature, as my grandmother would have said. This was one of them. The nature of the thing at Harlan Station was the nature of attention, of the very long accumulated awareness of a forest that had been itself in the same place for longer than human land tenure in this region, that had developed in that time, and in that place a quality of awareness that was not human awareness, and was not the awareness of any single organism within it, but that was, if you spend enough time in the right position with the right quality of attention, available to be met. Not threatening. Not benign in the way of something without qualities. Benign in the way of something that has had long enough to develop its own nature fully and is no longer interested in being anything other than what it is. I will go back in May. I will climb the ladder with the pack on my back and open the hatch and stand in the 14 by 14 feet of the cab that smells of Alderman's 9 years and my 1 year, and the specific accumulated quality of a place that has held sustained attention in one direction for a very long time. I will open the logbook to a new entry. I will write the date and the weather and the visibility and the fire weather index, and I will look north. I came back to the hollow because there was no one else left to come back that I want to establish that clearly at the start, because the rest of what I have to say will sound, in places, like the account of a person who was drawn back by something more than practical obligation. And I want the practical obligation on record as the true and sufficient explanation I held until it stopped being sufficient. My mother died in March. The property had been in the family since before the county had a name for the hollow it sat in. For generations of unbroken tenure on a piece of ground in the ridge and valley country of Western Virginia that had been logged twice and farmed 3 times and had outlasted every human plan ever made for it, with the specific patience of land that knows it will be there after the plans are gone. I was the last one. I came back to settle the estate, to decide what to do with the house and the outbuildings and the 43 acres of second-growth hardwood that ran from the hollow floor up both sides to the ridges above. I had been away for 22 years. I had no sentimental plan to return permanently and no romantic plan to preserve the property as a monument to the family that had held it. I had a practical obligation and a finite window in which to fulfill it, and I came back in April, a month after the funeral, with the intention of being done and gone by summer. I want to say that clearly because what happened was not what I intended, and I want the distinction between what I intended and what happened to be legible from the beginning. The distinction matters. I have thought about it for the better part of a year now, and I believe it is the most important distinction in the account. The hollow was called Elkins Hollow on the county survey maps, a name that corresponded to no family I could trace in 4 generations of tenure and that the family had never used. We called it the Hollow, the way families call the place they live by what it is rather than by the name someone else gave it. The hollow was a mile-long drainage running east to west between 2 parallel ridges, the north ridge higher and more heavily forested, the south ridge lower and drier. The hollow floor following the creek that ran year-round and fed into the larger stream 2 miles to the west at the point where the hollow opened onto the broader valley. The house was 3/4 of the way up the hollow from the opening. In the section where the 2 ridges came closest together and the floor of the hollow narrowed, the creek pressed close to the north ridge and the pasture on the south side barely wide enough to have ever been practical. The house had been built in that location by my great-great-grandfather for reasons that were not recorded and that I had never thought to ask about when someone who might have known was still alive to be asked that I arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of April. The drive from the valley took longer than I remembered from childhood, not because the roads had changed, but because the act of returning to a place after 22 years produces a specific dislocation in the traveler, a mismatch between the internalized map you have been carrying and the external geography you are moving through, the way the distances feel wrong, the way the landmarks are both exactly where you left them and in the wrong places, the way the approach to the familiar from a long absence has a quality of dream in which the known and the not quite right coexist without resolution. The county road turned to gravel at the hollow's mouth. The gravel was the same gravel. The sycamores along the creek bank were larger than they had been, but they were the same trees, their bark in the April light the same party-colored white and gray and faint green of a sycamore that has been in one place long enough to have grown comfortable in it. The house was standing and intact. I had arranged with a neighbor, a woman named Darlene, who had been the nearest neighbor for the full 22 years of my absence, and who had been the one to call me about my mother, to have the utilities running and the water on. She had done this and had left a note on the kitchen table that gave me the information I needed about the water heater and the septic and the propane levels, and ended with a single line that I read and set aside and would return to many times in the months that followed. The line was, "The house is fine, but the hollow is different at night than it used to be, and I thought you should know that I did not know what to do with that information on the first evening." I had a practical list of things to assess and document, and I worked through the list as the afternoon light moved through the house, room by room, noting what needed attention and what was in reasonable condition and what was beyond reasonable repair. The house was old and had the specific quality of a house that has been inhabited continuously by the same family for a very long time. The kind of patina that is not neglect and not decoration, but the accumulated texture of the generations of living that have happened in its rooms. The kitchen table had been used so long that the grain of the wood had worn through the finish in the places where hands rested habitually. The floorboards in the hallway had a path of greater darkness running their length from the front door to the back, the darkness of feet that had walked the same route for 120 years. The walls held the specific smell of old plaster and wood smoke and the cedar of the closets and the faint, indefinable smell of a house that has been somebody's home for as long as it has been a house. I had grown up inside that smell. Being inside it again produced, in the specific way of olfactory memory, the specific quality of return that the visual experience of the approach had produced in the wrong dream register, but that the smell produced in the right one. In the register of the real. I ate at the kitchen table and sat afterward in the chair my mother had kept at the south window of the kitchen because it had the best natural light in the house for the hours she preferred to read, and I looked out the south window at the south ridge darkening in the early evening, the light going out of the upper ridge line, and the hollow filling from the bottom up with the particular kind of dark that a narrow hollow fills with. When the ridges on both sides cut off the ambient sky, it was a dark I knew. Not the dark of absence of light exactly, more the dark of presence of the hollow's own quality. The specific density that a narrow drainage between two forested ridges generates as the day's retained warmth rises and the cold air flows down the creek, and the two processes meet at the hollow floor and produce a stillness that is cooler and heavier than the air on the ridges above it. I went to bed early because the drive had been long and the assessment had been thorough, and I was tired in the productive way of a person who has spent a day doing things that needed doing. The bedroom I used was the one I had grown up in the northwest corner of the house, its window facing up hollow toward the east ridge that closed the hollow at its upper end. I had slept in that room every night of my childhood and a significant portion of my adolescence. I knew what the window showed, and I knew what the sounds were that came through it at night. The creak and the nighttime insect sound, and the occasional sound of the larger animals that moved through the hollow, deer and foxes, and once, when I was 12, a bear that had left tracks in the creek bank mud that my father and I had examined in the morning with the specific mutual pleasure of a man and a child looking at evidence of a world larger than their own. That I knew what the window showed. What it showed that first night was the same thing it had always shown. The darkness of the hollow's east end with the stars visible through the gap in the ridgeline above where the hollow narrowed to its head. There was no moon. The stars were the same stars I had looked at from that window my whole childhood, or I had long since set for the season. The spring constellations making their rotations overhead in the slice of sky the ridgeline gap allowed. But after a while I started to notice small things. That I noticed that the creek sound was not quite right. Not wrong in a measurable way. The creek was running at the spring level it should have been running at, the volume consistent with the recent precipitation and the snowmelt drainage from the upper slopes. And the sound it produced was the sound a creek of that volume makes over the specific arrangement of the bed it has been running over for however long that creek has been there. But within that sound there was a quality I did not recognize, a harmonic or a rhythm or a specific element in the texture of the running water sound that had not been part of it when I was a child. Not foreign, not alarming, just not familiar in the way I expected it to be familiar. As though the creek had, in the 22 years of my absence, learned a new note. As though something in its composition had changed in the same way that a voice you have known for a long time and then not heard for a long time has changed, recognizably itself, but not identical to the version you carried in memory. That I lay in the childhood bed and listened to the creek and told myself it was the normal difference between a remembered thing and a re-encountered thing. The gap that 22 years of non-listening would naturally produce between a sound you thought you knew and the actual sound it turned out to be. This was reasonable. This was the correct application of the scientific principle that memory is reconstructive, that the sound I remembered was a construction of childhood perception and not an accurate archive of the sound itself. The creek had not changed. I had changed, and my encounter with an unchanged thing was producing the sensation of change. This was reasonable, and it was probably correct, and I held it in the way you hold a reasonable and probably correct explanation that has nonetheless left a remainder, a quality in the experience that the explanation doesn't fully account for, but that is too small and too indeterminate to require a different explanation. I held it and went to sleep. I woke at some point in the deep middle of the night. I do not know what time. The specific quality of the wakefulness was the quality of having been awake for some time without knowing it, the quality of a person who has crossed from sleeping to not sleeping at a point below the threshold of their awareness, and who surfaces to full consciousness already in motion, already attending to something, already in the middle of a process that began before they were aware of it. I was lying still and looking at the east window and the slice of sky above the ridgeline gap and the specific arrangement of the stars in that window, and I was aware, with the specific certainty of a person who has been lying still and attending in the dark for an indeterminate amount of time, that something outside the window was attending to me, not watching. Attending. I want to hold the distinction because it is the distinction that matters. Watching is a one-directional act, a subject directing attention to an object. Attending, in the sense I mean it, is mutual. It has the quality of a communication that is not in words, but that is recognizably communicative, recognizably two-directional, recognizably the operation of two things aware of each other's awareness. What I felt through the east window in the deep middle of that first night was not a predatory attention and not a threatening attention and not any quality that mapped onto the category of danger that the human nervous system maintains for exactly the purpose of the deep night and the dark window and the sound of something outside that is not what you expect. It was something that mapped onto a different category entirely, a category I did not have a clear label for, but that was in the family of recognition. Of being known by something that you have not yet fully understood. I lay still for a long time, and then I slept again. In the morning, I walked the property. This was the practical agenda for the first full day. A perimeter walk to assess the fence lines and the outbuildings and the general condition of the 43 acres, which I had not seen in their current state and which I needed to assess before I could make any rational decision about what to do with them. I started from the house and walked up hollow first, following the creek to the head of the hollow where the drainage narrowed between the two ridges to a gap barely wide enough for the creek to run through, a place I had known as a child as the place where the hollow ended and the ridge began. The gap at the head of the hollow had always had, in my childhood experience of it, a quality of threshold, the specific quality of a place where one kind of space gives way to another. Going up through the gap and out onto the ridge above felt, when I was a child, like leaving something rather than arriving somewhere. Coming back down through the gap and into the hollow felt like returning. The hollow had been bounded by that threshold on the east, the opposite end open to the valley on the west, and the distinction between inside and outside the hollow had been a physical sensation as much as a geographical fact. Standing at the head of the hollow in the April morning, 22 years later, the threshold quality of the gap was intact. More than intact. Amplified in the way that things you perceived partially as a child are amplified when you return to them as an adult with more perceptual vocabulary, more basis for comparison, more capacity to name what the child only registered. The gap had a quality that I want to describe as intentional, not in the sense of having been made by a human intention, but in the sense of being purposeful in its own way, oriented in a direction, serving a function that was not the function of a geological feature, but the function of a place that has been in relation to the space it bounds for long enough to have become definitional to it. The hollow was defined by the gap. The gap was not just the head of the drainage. It was the reason the hollow was the specific kind of place it was. I stood in the gap for a long time. The ridges were close on both sides, and the spring canopy above was the new leaf green of early April, and the light through it was the specific quality of spring light in a hardwood forest, dappled and moving with the light wind. The creek came through the gap from the east, from the upper drainage on the other side of the ridge, and entered the hollow with a sound that was different from the sound it had downstream. A higher voice, thinner, the voice of a younger section of the creek on a steeper gradient. I listened to it for a while, and then I turned around and looked down the hollow, back toward the house, and I had the specific experience of seeing a place from a position I had stood in before and finding it larger than I remembered. The hollow was larger, not in any measurable dimension. The width was consistent with my memory, the ridges at the same distance on both sides, the hollow floor the same approximate width. But the space of it, the felt volume of the hollow as a place, was larger than it had been in my memory of it, larger than the dimensions should have produced, a spatial quality that exceeded the measurements in the same way that certain rooms exceed the measurements of their four walls when something in them, some quality of their use or their age or the attention that has been concentrated in them, generates a presence that is more than the sum of the room's physical dimensions. I noted this and continued the property walk and did not try to explain it and finished the perimeter assessment by noon and came back to the house and made lunch and ate it at the kitchen table and spent the afternoon making calls about the estate and working through the documentation that needed to be organized and doing the practical things that had brought me here and that I was still, on the second day, fully intending to complete and then leave. That I found my grandmother's journals in the attic on the fourth day. I had known they existed. She had kept journals throughout her adult life, and my mother had mentioned them over the years in the general way of met.